Welcome to Lotus Whisper, Zen Tales for Sleep. Tonight, we explore a feeling as old as life itself, the sharp, sudden instinct that rises when we face the unknown, the difficult, the frightening. It is the primal whisper that asks a simple question: will you fight, or will you take flight? This choice seems to be the very foundation of survival, a tense string pulled taut between aggression and escape. But in the quiet halls of a mountain monastery, there is a different teaching, a teaching that suggests the greatest strength is found not in reacting, but in resting. It points to a third path, a space of profound stillness, where fear is not an enemy to be conquered or a monster to be fled, but simply a cloud passing in the vast sky of the mind. Tonight's story is an invitation to walk this path. Please subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this. Part 1. The Whispering Fear. The life of Kaito, a young monk in the monastery of the Silent Mountain, was a quiet river that ran over a bed of sharp stones. To the other monks, he was diligent, quiet, and composed. He moved through the morning chants, the silent meals, and the endless sweeping of stone pathways with a grace that seemed to speak of inner peace. But beneath the surface, his mind was a constant, churning torrent of whispers. His fear was not a loud, roaring beast, but a subtle, persistent guest that sat with him in meditation and walked beside him in the gardens. It was the fear of 1,000 small things, a web of what-ifs that caught every moment and held it captive. What if he failed in his duties? What if the senior monks saw the fraudulence he felt in his own heart? What if he was not meant for this path, and every breath he took in this sacred space was a kind of theft? These questions were not thoughts he chose to have. They were like the weather of his mind, a low, gray mist that clung to everything, dampening the colors of the world. He would watch a cherry blossom fall, a perfect moment of transient beauty, and the whisper would come. What if you are the only one who does not understand its meaning? He would hear the deep, resonant sound of the temple bell, and the whisper would ask, what if its call to awaken is lost on you? His anxiety was a current that pulled him away from the present moment. During zazen, the seated meditation, he was supposed to be watching his breath, feeling the simple, solid reality of his own existence. But instead, he found himself watching the future, a future he painted in the pale colors of failure and disappointment. He would imagine the abbot, Master Kenji, calling him into his chambers, his kind eyes filled with a gentle sadness as he explained that Kaito's efforts were not enough. He would picture himself walking back down the mountain path, the monastery gates closing behind him, a failure in a world he so desperately wished to understand. This inner turmoil was his most closely guarded secret. He learned to arrange his face into a mask of placid concentration. He learned to keep his hands from trembling as he served tea. He learned to measure his steps so that the frantic energy inside him would not betray itself in a hurried pace. The monastery, with its profound silence and its unyielding routine, should have been a balm for his soul. But for Kaito, the silence was a vast, empty room that echoed with the sound of his own fearful thoughts. The routine was a tightrope he had to walk every day, terrified of a single misstep. One morning, after the rice gruel had been cleared away, and the sun was just beginning to warm the ancient stones of the courtyard, Master Kenji summoned him. The master was a man who seemed to be carved from the mountain itself. His presence was vast and still, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were in constant conversation with the air around him. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were like smooth, heavy stones dropped into a pond, sending ripples of meaning far and wide. Kaito bowed low, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. A summons was unusual. It could mean anything, and in Kaito's mind, anything usually meant the worst. He followed the master out of the main hall, past the koi pond where orange and white fish drifted like living calligraphy, and toward the less traveled paths that wound around the back of the monastery. They walked in silence, the only sounds the crunch of their sandals on the gravel and the distant, rhythmic chop of a monk cutting firewood. Master Kenji stopped at a small, overgrown trail that led away from the manicured grounds and into the edge of the wild forest. The air here was different. It was cooler, thick with the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and decay. It was the smell of things untamed. "This path," the master said, his voice calm and low, "leads to the old medicine garden. It has been neglected for many years. The walls are crumbling, and the weeds have claimed it. Your task, Kaito, is to tend to it. Bring it back to life." Kaito looked from the master's unreadable face to the dark mouth of the trail. The old medicine garden. He had heard whispers of it, a place on the very edge of the monastery's land, bordering the deep, unmapped forest that climbed the rest of the mountain. It was said that the wind there carried strange sounds, and that the shadows at dusk played tricks on the eyes. It was a place of isolation. The familiar cold dread washed over him. His mind, always a fertile ground for fear, began to sprout a thicket of worries. Alone? So far from the others? What if a wild boar wandered in from the forest? What if a poisonous snake lay coiled beneath a stone? What if the solitude itself became a kind of madness? The task felt less like an instruction and more like a punishment, a test designed for him to fail. He wanted to speak, to object, to say that his skills were with books, with sweeping, with the predictable order of the main temple. He wanted to fight the command. Or he wanted to flee, to turn and run from the dark path, from the master's heavy gaze, from the impossible weight of the task. But he did neither. He pressed his palms together, bowed his head, and said the only thing a novice could say. "Yes, Master." The master simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, and then turned and walked back toward the heart of the monastery, his gray robes melting into the morning mist. He left Kaito standing alone at the threshold of his new world, a world of fear. With a deep, unsteady breath, Kaito took the first step onto the path. The branches of overgrown bamboo and wild maple closed in around him, and the familiar sounds of the monastery faded, replaced by the humming of insects and the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. The path was steep and uneven, littered with slick, moss-covered rocks. He had to watch every step, yet his mind was miles away, lost in scenarios of what could go wrong. A twisted ankle, a fall, becoming lost. The walk was not long, perhaps only 10 minutes, but it felt like a journey into another realm. He felt a profound sense of separation, as if a rope connecting him to the safety of the community had been cut. Here, there were no bells to mark the time, no senior monks to observe his posture, no structure to hold him. There was only the path, the forest, and the frantic beating of his own heart. He emerged from the trees into a small, sunken clearing. And there it was, the garden. It was worse than he had imagined. It was a ruin. A low stone wall, which must have once enclosed it, had crumbled in several places, the stones scattered and half buried in the earth. Inside the enclosure, a riot of weeds, thorny vines, and tough, wild grasses grew in a tangled mat, choking everything. He could barely make out the faint, straight lines that suggested where planting beds had once been. In the center stood a single, gnarled plum tree, its branches bare and twisted, like the arthritic fingers of an old man reaching for a sky he could no longer touch. The place was saturated with an atmosphere of neglect and decay. It did not feel like a part of the monastery. It felt like a place the monastery had forgotten, a wound in the landscape left to fester. And this was to be his work, to bring life to this place of death. The sheer impossibility of it settled on him like a physical weight, pressing the air from his lungs. Where would he even begin? To pull one weed would be to disturb 100 others. To move one stone would be to risk the collapse of another. He stood at the broken entrance, paralyzed. The whispers in his mind grew louder in the oppressive silence of the clearing. You cannot do this. It is too much. You do not have the strength or the skill or the patience. Master Kenji has finally seen your weakness and has given you a task that will prove it to you. Everyone, this is where you will fail. He looked around, and his fear began to paint pictures on the canvas of the world. The dark, silent trees of the surrounding forest were no longer just trees. They were watchers, ancient and indifferent, waiting for him to surrender. The rustle of leaves in a sudden gust of wind was not just the wind. It was a warning, a secret language he could not understand but whose meaning he felt in his bones. A shadow that flickered at the edge of his vision was not a bird. It was something else, something that lived in the liminal space between the known and the unknown. His body responded to the fear. A cold sweat prickled his neck. His hands, hidden in the long sleeves of his robe, were clenched into tight fists. His breath was shallow, caught high in his chest. The primal instinct that the master had not given him a chance to voice now screamed within him. Fight. Flee. The urge to flee was immense. He could turn around, walk back down the path, pack his few belongings in a cloth, and be gone from the mountain by nightfall. He could escape this garden, this monastery, this feeling of inadequacy. He could find a simple life in a village, a life where no one expected him to be enlightened, where no one watched him and found him wanting. The thought was a sweet, seductive poison. It promised relief, an end to the constant, grinding pressure of his own mind. Then the urge to fight surged. Not to physically fight, but to resist. He could march back to Master Kenji and state his case. He could argue that the task was unreasonable, that he was not suited for it, that another monk with more experience in gardening should be assigned. He could stand up for himself, defend the small, terrified part of him that felt so utterly overwhelmed. He could refuse. But he remained rooted to the spot, caught in the cross-currents of these two powerful urges. To flee felt like cowardice. To fight felt like arrogance. And so he did neither. He simply stood there, a statue of indecision, while the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the ruined garden. He took a tentative step into the enclosure, his sandal sinking into the soft, damp earth. He reached down and touched the leaf of a large, thorny weed. It was rough and resilient. He pulled at it, but its roots held firm deep in the soil. He pulled harder, his knuckles straining, and finally it came free with a tearing sound, bringing a clump of dark earth with it. He held the weed in his hand, its roots dangling like severed nerves. He had removed one. But looking around, he saw thousands, perhaps millions more. An ocean of them. A wave of despair washed over him, so powerful it made him dizzy. It was a hopeless task. Every effort he made would be a tiny, insignificant gesture against an overwhelming tide of decay. The garden was a perfect reflection of his own inner world, a tangled, hopeless mess. And the instruction to tend it felt like a cruel joke. A command to straighten the ocean or to count the grains of sand on a beach. He sank to his knees in the middle of the chaos, the uprooted weed still clutched in his hand. He was not a monk in a garden. He was a small, frightened boy lost in a dark wood. The silence of the place pressed in on him, and for the first time, he felt a loneliness so profound it was like a physical ache in his chest. There was no one to help him, no one to guide him, no one to even witness his struggle. He closed his eyes, but the image of the garden was burned into the back of his eyelids. The tangled vines, the crumbling stones, the skeletal plum tree. It was the landscape of his own soul. And the whispering fear, which had been his constant companion for so long, was no longer a whisper. Here, in this forgotten place at the edge of the world, it had finally found its voice, and it was screaming. Kaito stayed there, on his knees, surrounded by the ruin that was his new home, a prisoner of a garden and a mind that he did not know how to tend. The day was still young, but for him, a long, dark night had just begun. He remained on his knees for a long time, the dampness of the earth slowly seeping through the coarse fabric of his robe, a cold reminder of his connection to this place of decay. The sun, a silent, indifferent witness, continued its slow arc across the sky. Its warmth on his shaven head should have been comforting, but it felt instead like a spotlight, illuminating his failure for the unseen eyes of the forest. The single weed he had pulled lay beside him, already beginning to wilt, its small act of resistance finished. It seemed to mock him. "One," it seemed to say, "you have conquered one of us. Now look at the rest." His mind, left untethered, began to drift back through time, seeking the source of this profound feeling of inadequacy, as a tongue seeks the source of an ache in a tooth. He remembered his father, a carpenter whose hands were maps of hard work, calloused and sure. He remembered being a small boy in his father's workshop, the air thick with the clean, sharp scent of cedar wood. His father had given him a small block of wood and a carving knife, instructing him to make a simple toy boat. Kaito had tried, his small hands clumsy and weak. He had held the knife wrong, and the wood had splintered. He had tried to force a curve where the grain resisted, and a large chunk had broken away, leaving the boat misshapen and ugly. He had not cried. He had simply looked up at his father, holding the ruined piece of wood, and had seen not anger, but a deep, quiet disappointment in his eyes. His father had said nothing. He had simply taken the splintered wood from Kaito's hand and tossed it into the pile for the fire. He had not offered him another piece. The memory was so vivid that Kaito could almost smell the cedar shavings and feel the sting of unshed tears in his eyes. This garden felt like that block of wood. He was that same. Clumsy boy, holding the wrong tool, applying pressure in the wrong places, destined only to break what he was meant to shape. Master Kenji was his father, looking upon him with that same quiet, heavy disappointment. Perhaps the master had not even needed to see the result. Perhaps he knew, from the moment he gave Kaito the task, that this would be the outcome. The thought was a fresh wave of shame that washed over him, hot and sickening. The afternoon wore on. The shadows of the tall pines at the edge of the clearing began to stretch like dark water, slowly creeping across the garden toward him. The quality of the silence changed. The busy hum of daytime insects gave way to the first tentative chirps of evening crickets. A cool breeze rustled the leaves of the gnarled plum tree, and it sounded like a dry, weary sigh. Kaito's fear began to change too. The frantic, screaming panic subsided, worn down by its own intensity, and was replaced by a hollow, aching dread. It was the dread of certainty. The certainty that he could not and would not succeed. His internal voice, the whisper that had grown into a scream, now softened into a tone of cold, clear reason. Fleeing is the only sensible path, it told him. There is no shame in admitting defeat when the battle is unwinnable. To stay here is to choose to suffer. It is a form of pride to think you must endure this. A true act of humility would be to accept your limitations and walk away. Go now, before the forest is completely dark. Go before you have to face the master again. The logic was seductive. It presented escape not as an act of cowardice, but as an act of wisdom. He could almost feel the lightness in his limbs, the relief of walking away, of leaving this impossible burden behind. Yet something held him. It was not courage or determination. It was a kind of inertia, the profound exhaustion of a spirit that had been fighting itself for years. He simply did not have the energy to stand up and run. So he sat, shifting from his knees to a seated position on the cold ground, his back against a crumbling section of the stone wall. He watched as dusk performed its slow magic, blurring the sharp edges of the world, melting the individual shapes of the weeds into a single, dark mass. The clearing became a bowl of deepening shadows, with the last vestiges of pale blue light lingering in the sky above. The air grew colder. He shivered, pulling his robes tighter around him. He was hungry, his stomach a tight knot. He was alone, and for the first time a new fear emerged, one that was not born of his mind, but of the world itself. It was the ancient fear of the dark, of the things that move in the night. Every snap of a twig in the forest beyond the wall was a footstep. Every hoot of a distant owl was a cry of something unknown. The garden was no longer just a symbol of his inner failure. It was a real place, filled with real and potential dangers, and he was completely exposed. The choice was no longer an abstract one. To stay meant to face this primal fear. To flee meant to run through a dark, unfamiliar forest. And to fight. What was there to fight? The darkness? The weeds? The crushing weight of his own heart? There was nothing to push against. There was only the yielding, suffocating presence of it all. Part 2. The Master's Silent Gaze. The darkness in the garden was not merely an absence of light. It was a presence. It settled into the clearing like a fine black silt, filling every space, covering every leaf and stone. Kaito sat with his back against the cold, damp wall, feeling the night seep into his bones. His hunger had subsided into a dull ache, and his body was stiff with cold and inactivity. But his mind was a furnace of frantic energy. The primal fears of the night, of wild animals and unseen dangers, were now secondary to the raging storm of his own thoughts. The garden had become a cell, and he was its only prisoner. He replayed the master's words, turning them over and over, searching for a hidden meaning, a clue he had missed. Tend to it. Bring it back to life. The command was so simple, yet it felt like a koan to which he had no answer. Was it a test of his spirit, a punishment for some unknown failing? Or was it, as his fear insisted, a quiet, final judgment on his inadequacy? He could find no kindness in the memory of the master's face, only a vast, mountainous indifference. The urge to flee, which had been a seductive whisper, now became a detailed plan. He pictured himself rising silently, slipping through the broken wall and finding the main path down the mountain. He knew the route. He could be at the foot of the mountain by dawn. He imagined the small fishing village by the sea, the smell of salt and drying nets. He could find work there. He could be anonymous, a man with a simple past and a simpler future. No more chanting, no more meditation, no more striving for an enlightenment that felt as distant as a star. The fantasy was so complete, so tangible, that for a moment he felt the phantom sensation of the sea breeze on his face. It was a powerful lure, the promise of an end to this constant, grinding effort to be something he was not. But as the vision of escape crested, another wave rose to meet it, the urge to fight. It was a hot, bitter feeling, born of shame and a desperate need for validation. Who was Master Kenji to do this to him? To cast him out into this forgotten corner without a word of guidance or encouragement? Was this compassion? Was this the wisdom of a Zen master? It felt like cruelty. It felt like a betrayal. A speech began to form in his mind, a torrent of words he had held back for years. He would go back. He would not run away like a frightened child. He would stand before the master and he would speak. He would tell him of the constant anxiety, of the feeling of being an imposter. He would describe the hopelessness of this garden, the impossibility of the task. He would ask, directly, what he had done to deserve this exile. He would demand an answer. The thought of this confrontation filled him with a terrifying, exhilarating energy. It was the energy of a cornered animal, the moment it decides to turn and face its pursuer. For hours he was tossed between these two poles. Fleeing was the path of peace, of surrender. Fighting was the path of dignity, of self-respect. Both promised a kind of release from the unbearable tension of his current state. To remain here, sitting in the cold dark, was the one thing he could no longer do. The paralysis had broken. A decision had to be made. With a surge of adrenaline that made his head swim, he chose. He would not run. He would not disappear into the night and confirm his own narrative of failure. He would walk back into the heart of the monastery, into the lion's den, and he would speak his truth. He did not know what would happen. He might be scolded. He might be dismissed from the monastery. But he would not leave as a shadow. He would leave, if he had to, as a man who had finally spoken. Getting to his feet was a painful, awkward process. His legs were numb, his joints stiff. He stumbled, catching himself on the crumbling wall. The stones were slick with dew. He took a deep breath of the cold night air, a breath that felt like the first one he had taken in hours. He did not look back at the garden. He fixed his eyes on the dark opening in the trees that marked the path and began to walk. The journey back was a strange ordeal. The path that had seemed merely overgrown in the daylight was now a treacherous, living thing. Roots snaked across the ground, eager to catch his ankle. Low-hanging branches, invisible in the gloom, whipped at his face. The sounds of the forest were louder now, more intimate. A sudden rustle in the bushes to his left made him freeze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited, listening, every muscle tensed. Silence. He moved on, his steps now more hurried, less mindful. With every step, he rehearsed his speech, honing the words, sharpening the points of his argument. He would be respectful, of course, but he would be firm. He would not let the master's silence intimidate him this time. He would hold his ground. He fed his anger and his fear, letting them build into a righteous fire that could carry him through this ordeal. This fire was his shield against the darkness around him and the doubt within him. When he finally saw the soft, rectangular glow of a paper shoji screen through the trees, a wave of relief and renewed anxiety washed over him. He had made it back to the world of men, of order, of light. The monastery was asleep. The long wooden corridors were dark and silent, the air still and cool. His footsteps, loud in the forest, were now muffled on the polished wood. He felt like a ghost, a disturbance in the profound peace of the place. He knew where the master's quarters were, a small, simple building set slightly apart from the main halls, overlooking a raked sand garden. A single oil lamp was lit inside, casting a warm, gentle light through the paper screen. The master was awake. Kaito's heart leaped into his throat. This was it. There was no turning back now. He approached the screen, his hands trembling. He could hear no sound from within. He raised a hand to announce himself, but hesitated. What was he doing? He was a novice, about to disturb the abbot in the middle of the night, to present him with a list of complaints and demands. The sheer audacity of it almost sent him fleeing back into the darkness. But the memory of the cold, hopeless garden pushed him forward. He took another breath and knocked softly, his knuckles barely tapping the wooden frame. A moment of silence. Then, the master's voice, calm and even, not surprised in the least. "Enter." Kaito slid the screen open and stepped inside, bowing low from the waist. He kept his eyes fixed on the tatami mat, not daring to look up. The room was spare, containing only a low writing desk, a few rolled scrolls in a corner, and a single stalk of iris in a simple clay vase. The air smelled of old wood and the faint, clean scent of sandalwood incense. "Master," Kaito began, his voice a strained whisper. "Kaito," the master replied. There was no question in his voice, no invitation to speak further, just the simple acknowledgement of his name. Kaito straightened up and finally forced himself to look at his master. Kenji was seated in the center of the room, not writing or reading, but simply sitting in zazen posture, his hands folded in his lap. The lamplight softened the lines on his face, making him look ancient and timeless. He was not looking at Kaito, but his gaze was directed into the space of the room, a gaze that seemed to hold the stillness of the night within it. "Master," Kaito said again, his voice a little stronger now. The prepared speech, the well-rehearsed arguments were all there, queued up in his mind, ready to be released. "I have come from the garden." Master Kenji did not respond. He simply shifted his gaze, slowly, deliberately, until his eyes met Kaito's. And then the world fell away. The master's gaze was not what he had expected. It was not angry, or disappointed, or questioning, or even compassionate in a way Kaito could understand. It was like looking into the sky on a moonless night. It was vast, deep, and utterly still. There was no judgment in it, no expectation. It was a gaze that simply saw. It did not seek to change him, or fix him, or understand him. It just held him. In that profound silence, Kaito's carefully constructed speech began to crumble. The words of anger and self-pity suddenly seemed small and foolish. His arguments, which had felt so powerful and righteous in the darkness of the forest, now sounded like the petulant complaints of a child. The fire of his indignation, which he had nursed so carefully, was instantly extinguished. Not by a flood of water, but by a simple lack of air to burn. He opened his mouth to speak, to say something, anything, to fill the crushing silence. But no words came. His mind, which had been a raging torrent of thought and emotion, was suddenly, shockingly empty. He stood before his master, a hollow vessel. All his fear, all his planning, all his justification had been for this moment. And in this moment, they were gone. The master's gaze did not waver. It was like a perfect mirror, and in it, Kaito saw himself for the first time. He saw a young man trembling, not from the cold, but from the sheer force of his own mind. He saw the frantic energy, the desperate grasping for certainty, the endless stories he told himself about his own failure. He saw the fight and the flight as two heads of the same beast, a beast made of fear, a beast that lived inside him. The gaze did not condemn this beast. It did not praise it. It simply revealed it, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating. He felt his own gaze falter. He wanted to look away, to break the connection, to retreat back into the familiar noise of his own thoughts. But he could not. He was held fast by that silent, unmoving presence. The silence in the room deepened, becoming a physical thing, a pressure that pushed all the air out of his lungs. He felt utterly exposed, stripped bare of all his defenses. Minutes passed. It could have been an hour. Time itself seemed to have dissolved in the stillness of the room. Master Kenji did not move a muscle. He just sat, his eyes holding Kaito's. And slowly, something inside Kaito began to shift. The frantic energy did not return. In its place, a strange, unfamiliar calm began to spread, like cool water seeping into parched earth. It was not peace. It was not understanding. It was simply emptiness. A quiet space where the storm had been. Finally, with a slowness that seemed to take an eternity, Master Kenji blinked. It was a signal, a release. The connection was broken. Kaito found he could breathe again. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He was still standing in the same spot, his hands still clenched at his sides, but the world felt different. The room was just a room. The master was just a man, and he was just a young monk, standing in the middle of the night, lost and confused. Without a word, he bowed deeply, his forehead almost touching the mat. It was not the bow of a subordinate to a superior. It was the bow of a man who had come seeking a battle and had been met with a silence so profound that it had defeated him without a single blow. He had not won. He had not lost. The fight had simply been irrelevant. He straightened up, turned, and slid the screen door open. He stepped out into the cool night and closed it softly behind him. He had received no answers. He had been given no solutions. His problem, the garden, his fear, remained. And yet, everything had changed. He had come to fight, or to announce his flight, but had been shown a third possibility he did not understand. The possibility of a vast and terrifying stillness. He stood in the silent monastery courtyard, under a sky full of stars, more lost than he had ever been in his life. He did not know how long he stood there in the courtyard. The moon had risen, a perfect white disk in the black sky, casting the sharp, clean shadows of the temple roof onto the raked sand below. The patterns in the sand, usually a source of calm contemplation for him, now seemed like a cryptic map of a place he could not go, a language he could not read. He had walked out of the master's room with nothing, and yet he felt emptied of a great burden. The questions that had propelled him through the dark forest path were still there, but they had lost their sharp, agonizing edges. They were no longer demands, but faint, distant echoes. What am I to do? Why was I sent there? The questions floated in his mind, but they did not clamor for an answer. He felt a profound exhaustion, a weariness that went deeper than his stiff muscles and empty stomach. It was the exhaustion of a long, pointless war. He had been fighting his own mind for as long as he could remember, struggling against the tides of his own fear. Tonight, he had marched to the general's tent to surrender, or to make a final, desperate charge, and the general had not even been there. There was only an empty room and a mirror. Slowly, he began the walk back, not to his sleeping quarters, but back toward the path to the garden. He did not know why. There was no conscious decision, no sense of renewed purpose. His feet simply seemed to know that there was nowhere else to go. The monastery, with its sleeping monks and its serene order, felt alien to him now. He had been touched by a different kind of reality in the master's room, a reality of pure, unadorned presence, and the structured world of bells and chants seemed like a dream in comparison. The garden, in all its chaotic ruin, felt more real, more honest. It was a place that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. The return journey was entirely different from the one before. He was no longer fueled by anger or fear. He was simply a man, walking. The darkness of the forest did not feel menacing now. It was just dark. The sounds were just sounds, the call of a night bird, the whisper of wind in the bamboo. He noticed the smell of the damp earth, the feel of the cool air on his skin. His senses, which had been drowned out by the noise of his thoughts, were slowly reawakening. He was not rehearsing a speech. He was not planning an escape. He was just walking, one step after another, his sandals making a soft, rhythmic sound on the dirt path. When he reached the clearing, the garden was bathed in the ethereal light of the moon. The silver light transformed the place. The tangled weeds were no longer a symbol of decay, but a complex, intricate tapestry of silver and black. The crumbling stone walls seemed to possess a kind of ancient dignity. Even the gnarled plum tree, which had looked so skeletal and dead in the daylight, now had a stark, sculptural beauty, its twisted branches reaching up as if to receive the moonlight. He did not feel the same despair he had felt hours before. He did not feel hope either. He felt nothing. A quiet, neutral emptiness. He walked to the center of the garden and sat down, not in defeat this time, but simply because it was a place to sit. He did not know what to do next. The options of fight and flight had been burned away, leaving a void. He was supposed to tend this garden, to bring it back to life. But how? He had no tools, no knowledge, and now no motivation. Not even the motivation of fear. He sat for a long time, watching the slow, silent procession of the stars across the sky. He was not meditating. He was not thinking. He was simply existing, a small, still point in a vast, turning universe. The cold of the ground seeped into him, but he barely noticed. The hunger in his stomach was a distant sensation. He was a watcher. He watched the moon move. He watched the shadows shift. He watched the faint stirrings of his own thoughts as they arose and passed away like small clouds. I am cold. I am hungry. I am lost. The thoughts came, but they were no longer him. They were just phenomena, like the hoot of the owl or the rustle of the leaves. As the first hint of grey began to soften the eastern sky, a new feeling began to dawn in him. It was not an emotion. It was a simple physical awareness. He became aware of his own breath. He had, of course, been breathing all night, but he had not noticed it. Now he felt it. The cool air entering his nostrils, filling his lungs, and the slightly warmer air leaving his body. In and out. A simple, steady rhythm. It had been there all along, a constant, faithful companion through the storm of his fear and the emptiness that followed. It was the one thing that was real, the one thing that was happening right now, in this moment, and in the next. He sat in the ruined garden, under a fading moon, and for the first time in a very long time, he was simply here. Part 3. The Anchor of the Breath. The sky was turning from the deep, velvety black of night to a soft, bruised purple in the east. The moon, now pale and translucent, was a ghost of its former self, preparing to dissolve into the coming day. Kaito sat, unmoving, as the world was slowly reborn in color and light. He watched as the first rays of the sun, golden and tentative, touched the highest peaks of the mountains surrounding the monastery. The light crept down the slopes like liquid honey, spilling into the valleys, chasing the last of the shadows from their hiding places. The garden, which had been a stark composition of silver and black under the moon, now revealed its true palette. The tangled weeds were 100 shades of green, glistening with dew. The crumbling stones of the wall were grey and ochre, dotted with patches of vibrant green moss. The air was filled with the sound of the world waking up. The chirping of crickets faded, replaced by the first tentative notes of birdsong, a scattered chorus that grew in confidence as the light spread. The air itself felt new, washed clean by the night, carrying the scent of damp earth and the subtle fragrance of pine from the forest beyond. In the midst of this gentle awakening, Kaito remained a point of stillness. His attention was no longer on the grand drama of his failure or the terrifying emptiness of his future. It had narrowed, drawn inward to the simplest, most immediate reality he possessed. the rhythm of his own breathing. He felt the cool air touch the rim of his nostrils, a faint, delicate sensation. He followed it as it filled his lungs, feeling the slight expansion of his chest and abdomen. He noticed the brief, still pause at the peak of the inhalation, a moment of perfect fullness. Then, he followed the warm air back out, feeling the gentle contraction, the release, the letting go. In and out. A slow, steady tide. It was a rhythm that had been with him his entire life, yet he had never truly listened to it. It had been the silent, unnoticed background music to the loud, chaotic opera of his thoughts. Now, it was the only thing he heard. When a thought arose, a flicker of worry about the day ahead, a memory of the master's silent gaze, he did not push it away. He simply noted it, a cloud passing in the sky of his awareness, and then, gently, without force or judgment, he returned his attention to the breath. The breath was his home, the place he could always come back to. He did not know how much time had passed in this state of simple observation when he became aware that he was no longer alone. There had been no sound of footsteps, no rustle of robes. It was as if the man had materialized from the morning mist itself. Master Kenji stood at the broken entrance to the garden, his hands tucked into the sleeves of his grey robe, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. He was not looking at Kaito, but at the garden, his gaze soft and encompassing, as if he were taking in every dew-kissed leaf, every crumbling stone. Kaito felt a flicker of the old anxiety, the familiar tightening in his chest. The master was here. Was he pleased? Disappointed? Had he come to deliver a verdict? But the feeling passed as quickly as it came. Kaito returned his attention to his breath. In and out. He did not rise. He did not speak. He simply continued to sit, to breathe. After a long silence, the master moved. He walked slowly into the garden, his sandals making almost no sound on the soft earth. He did not stop in front of Kaito, but beside him, so they were both looking out at the same chaotic vista of weeds and ruin. "The sun is warm this morning," Master said. His voice was quiet, a simple observation, no different from a comment on the color of the sky. "Yes, Master," Kaito replied, his own voice raspy from disuse. Another long, comfortable silence settled between them. Kaito found that the master's presence was no longer a source of pressure. It was just another element in the morning, like the bird song or the warmth of the sun. "Last night," the master said, still looking at the garden, "you brought a great storm to my door. You stood there, ready to fight the hurricane or to run from the tidal wave." Kaito's face flushed with a faint memory of his own righteous anger. He bowed his head slightly. "I was confused, Master." "You wanted me to stop the storm," Kenji continued, his voice even and calm. "You wanted me to command the winds to cease and the waves to be still. Or you wanted me to give you a boat strong enough to escape it. But I did neither." "No, Master," Kaito whispered. "That is because the storm is not in the garden, Kaito. The storm is in you. To fight it is to exhaust yourself wrestling with your own shadow. To flee from it is to run from your own feet. Both paths lead only to more suffering, because you carry the weather with you wherever you go." The master turned his head then and looked down at Kaito. His eyes were not the vast, empty mirrors of the night before. In the morning light, they were clear and kind, filled with a deep, quiet understanding. "There is a third path," he said softly. It is not the path of fighting. It is not the path of fleeing. It is the path of stillness. It is the path of the anchor. He gestured for Kaito to look at the sea of weeds. Your mind is like a small boat on a great ocean. Sometimes the water is calm and glassy. At other times, a storm comes. The winds of fear begin to blow. The waves of anxiety rise and crash against the hull. Your thoughts are the wind. Your emotions are the waves. In the middle of the storm, the small boat is tossed about. The instinct is to do something, to row furiously against the waves, to fight the storm, or to pull up the sail and try to outrun it, to flee to a calmer sea. But you are a small boat in a vast ocean. You cannot command the weather. Kaito listened, his whole being focused on the master's words. The metaphor was so simple, yet it resonated with the deepest truth of his experience. But every boat, the master continued, can carry an anchor. The anchor does not stop the storm. It does not calm the waves. It does not make the wind cease. The storm will rage, just as it always has. But the anchor connects the boat to the deep, silent, unmoving earth beneath the water. The boat will still rise and fall with the waves. It will still be battered by the wind and the rain. But it will not be swept away. It will not be lost. It will hold its position in the heart of the storm. He paused, letting the image settle in Kaito's mind. Your breath, Kaito. Your breath is your anchor. It is always with you. It is always in the present moment. It connects you to the simple, solid reality of your own body, the deep, silent earth beneath the turbulent surface of your mind. The master then knelt down on the ground, facing Kaito, his movements fluid and graceful. He settled into a posture of meditation. Your task in this garden is not to pull every weed in a single day. That is fighting the storm. Your task is not to ignore the garden and wish you were somewhere else. That is fleeing the storm. Your task, for now, is simply this: to learn how to drop your anchor. Sit, just as you are sitting now. Your back is straight, but not stiff, like a stalk of bamboo, hollow and resilient. Your hands rest in your lap. Your eyes are half closed, your gaze resting on the ground a few feet in front of you. And you watch. Watch what, Master? Kaito asked. You watch the breath. Do not try to change it. Do not try to make it deeper or slower. The breath breathes itself. Your only work is to feel it. Feel the air as it enters. Feel it as it leaves. Let your attention rest there at the tip of your nose or in the rise and fall of your belly. Let it be the one place you return to again and again. But my mind, it wanders, Kaito confessed. The thoughts come back, the fear. Of course it does, the master said with a gentle smile. That is the nature of the mind. That is the wind and the waves. Do not be discouraged. When you notice your mind has wandered, that is a moment of awakening. In that moment, do not scold yourself, do not judge. Simply acknowledge where the mind has gone. Thinking about the future, or feeling fear. And then, gently, as you would guide a lost child back home, guide your attention back to the anchor, back to the breath. Each time you do this, you strengthen the anchor chain. Each time you return, you build the muscle of mindfulness. The master's instruction was a profound revelation. Kaito had always treated his wandering thoughts as a failure, a sign of his inadequacy in meditation. He had fought them, tried to suppress them, and had grown frustrated when they inevitably returned. The master was telling him that the wandering was not the problem, it was part of the process. The practice was not in having a perfectly still mind, but in the gentle, compassionate act of returning over and over again. "Do not try to solve the garden," Master Kenji said, his voice becoming very quiet. "Do not try to solve your fear. For now, just sit. Sit with the weeds. Sit with the crumbling stones. Sit with the fear. Let them all be there. Let the storm rage. And you just attend to your anchor. Feel the breath, in and out. This is your only work. Do this for 1 hour when the sun rises. Do this for 1 hour before the sun sets. The rest of the day you may begin to work slowly, pulling one weed at a time. But the foundation of all your work must be this stillness. First, you tend to the anchor. Then, you may tend to the boat." With that, the master placed his palms together and gave Kaito a slight, respectful bow. He rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion. He did not offer any further words of encouragement or praise. He simply turned and walked away, his grey robes melting back into the morning light, leaving Kaito alone once more. But this time, the solitude was not a lonely, terrifying thing. It was a gift. It was the space in which to practice. Kaito adjusted his posture, straightening his back and letting his shoulders relax. He lowered his gaze to the ground, a patch of dark earth and small green shoots. He closed his eyes to a soft slit and brought his full attention to his breath. Inhale, the cool morning air. Exhale, the release of warmth. A thought arose almost immediately. Will this really work? He saw the thought, acknowledged it without judgment, and gently returned his attention to the sensation of the breath. Inhale, the slight pause at the top. Exhale, the feeling of his body settling. A feeling arose, a familiar flicker of anxiety in his stomach. The garden is so big. The task is impossible. He felt the wave of emotion, let it be there without resisting it, and returned to his anchor. Inhale. Exhale. It was not easy. His mind was a wild horse, accustomed to running free in the fields of worry and speculation. It bucked and pulled against the reins of his attention. It presented him with 1,000 distractions, an itch on his nose, the sound of a distant woodpecker, a memory from his childhood, a plan for how he might start clearing the weeds. Each one was a temptation to leave the present moment, to abandon the anchor and be swept away by the current. But he remembered the master's words, gently, as you would guide a lost child back home. And so, with a patience he did not know he possessed, he kept returning. 1,000 times his mind wandered, and 1,000 times he gently guided it back. He was not fighting. He was not fleeing. He was just sitting. He was just breathing. He was holding his place in the heart of the storm. And for the first time, he had the feeling that the storm was not him, and he was not the storm. He was the quiet, watchful space in which it all happened. He sat until the sun had climbed well above the treetops, its warmth spreading across his back and shoulders, a comforting weight. The dew on the leaves had evaporated, and the initial chorus of birdsong had settled into the more sporadic calls of midday. His legs began to ache, a dull throb in his knees and ankles from the unaccustomed posture. His stomach rumbled with a hunger that was now sharp and insistent. These physical sensations became just another set of waves, another aspect of the weather to be observed. He noted the ache in his knee, felt its quality. Was it sharp or dull, throbbing or constant? And then returned to the breath. He noted the hunger, the emptiness in his stomach, and returned to the breath. He was not ignoring the discomfort, nor was he indulging it. He was simply allowing it to be, a part of the rich, complex texture of the present moment. Slowly, subtly, a shift occurred. The space between his thoughts began to lengthen. In the beginning, his mind had been a constant chatter, a waterfall of noise. Now there were moments of quiet, brief, fleeting gaps of pure, thought-free awareness. In these gaps, the world seemed to come alive in a new way. He could hear the low hum of a bee visiting a small purple wildflower hidden amongst the weeds. He could feel the precise texture of his robe against his skin. The world was no longer a concept, a thing to be analyzed and worried about. It was a direct, vibrant, sensory experience. The breath itself began to change. As his mind and body settled, his breathing naturally became slower, deeper, more rhythmic. It was no longer something he had to focus on with effort. His attention seemed to rest upon it naturally, like a butterfly resting on a flower. The anchor was holding. The boat was still rising and falling on the waves of sensation and thought, but it was secure. When he finally decided the hour was over, he did not move abruptly. He brought a gentle awareness to the intention to move. He felt the impulse in his muscles before they acted. Slowly, mindfully, he unfolded his legs, stretching them out in front of him, feeling the tingle of returning circulation. He flexed his ankles and rotated his neck. Every movement was deliberate, observed. He rose to his feet, not with the frantic energy of a man with an impossible task, but with the slow, measured grace of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do but this. He looked at the garden. It was the same garden, the same tangled mess, the same crumbling walls, but his relationship to it had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a monument to his failure. It was no longer an enemy to be conquered. It was simply what was, a piece of earth, neglected for a time, waiting. He remembered the master's instruction. The rest of the day, you may begin to work, slowly, pulling one weed at a time. He looked down at the ground near his feet. He saw a single large weed with broad, dark leaves. He knelt down, his movements still slow and mindful. He did not yank at it with frustration. He observed it. He saw the way its stem grew from the center, the pattern of veins on its leaves, the small, almost invisible thorns along its edges. He placed his hands around the base of the plant, feeling the texture of the stem and the coolness of the soil. He began to pull, gently at first, feeling for the direction of the main root. He felt the resistance of the earth. He applied steady, patient pressure, not fighting the resistance, but working with it. He felt the small, fibrous roots begin to tear, and then, with a soft, satisfying sigh, the main taproot released its grip. He held the weed in his hands, its long, pale root dangling below. He looked at the small patch of dark, empty soil it had left behind. He had not cleared the garden. He had not solved the problem. He had simply pulled one weed, and it was enough. He laid the weed aside and looked for another. This, he now understood, was the work. Not the grand, heroic project of restoring the entire garden at once, but the simple, humble, moment-to-moment act of pulling one weed, and then another. His work in the garden was no different from his work in meditation. When a thought arose, he gently removed it and returned to the breath. When a weed appeared before him, he gently removed it and returned to the soil. The inner and outer work were one and the same. The stillness he was cultivating in his mind was the very ground from which this new, patient action could grow. The anchor had to be tended first, for without it, any work he did would be frantic, anxious, and ultimately unsustainable. He had his tool now. It was not a spade or a hoe. It was his own breath. And with it, he could begin. Part 4. Watching the shadow play. The days in the garden fell into a rhythm, a slow, quiet pulse that was governed not by the monastery's bell, but by the rising and setting of the sun. Kaito's life, which had once felt like a frantic scramble to keep up, simplified into a cycle of 3 core activities: sitting, working, and resting. The boundaries between them were soft, and the same quality of mindful attention began to permeate them all. Each morning, as the first light spilled into the clearing, he would find his place near the gnarled plum tree and sit. This hour of zazen was the foundation of his day. It was his time to drop the anchor, to reacquaint himself with the deep, quiet stillness that lay beneath the surface of his mind. At first, the practice remained a struggle. His mind, like a spoiled child, rebelled against the discipline. It would conjure vivid daydreams of a warm meal, replay old conversations with a sharp sting of regret, or spin elaborate fantasies of the future in which the garden was miraculously transformed and he was praised by Master Kenji. He learned to greet these mental visitors with a kind of gentle, detached curiosity. He saw them not as enemies to be vanquished, but as shadows playing on a wall. A shadow may look menacing, it may twist itself into the shape of a monster, but it has no substance. It cannot harm the wall on which it appears. His awareness, he began to realize, was the wall, vast, stable, and unaffected. The thoughts and feelings were the shadows, transient, insubstantial, and utterly dependent on a light source of attention to even exist. He began to notice the specific character of his fear. It was not a single, monolithic entity. It was a collection of stories, a cast of recurring characters. There was the failure story, in which he was always clumsy, inadequate, and destined for disappointment. There was the judgment story, where the eyes of the other monks, and especially the master, were always upon him, watching, weighing, and finding him wanting. There was the catastrophe story, a particularly creative narrative in which every rustle in the forest was a wild beast, every stomach cramp a fatal illness, every cloud in the sky a sign of a coming typhoon. Instead of being swept away by these stories, he started to watch them as one might watch a play. He would sit on the cushion of his breath and observe the drama unfold on the stage of his mind. When the failure story began, he would simply label it in his mind. Ah, the story of my inadequacy is playing now. He would note the feelings that accompanied it, the tightness in his chest, the sinking feeling in his stomach, and he would breathe into them, not to make them go away, but to simply be with them, to acknowledge their presence without becoming them. This practice of disidentification was transformative. The fear was still there, but it was no longer his fear. It was just fear, an impersonal energy passing through his awareness. The stories were still told, but he was no longer the main character, helplessly caught in the plot. He was the audience, watching the shadow play with a growing sense of compassionate distance. He saw how these stories, which he had believed to be the absolute truth of his existence, were nothing more than habits of the mind, deep grooves carved by years of repetitive, unconscious thinking. After his morning sitting, he would begin his work. He had found a small, rusty trowel and a sickle in a dilapidated shed at the edge of the clearing, his only tools. His work was slow and methodical. He did not set grand goals for himself, like clearing an entire section in a day. His goal was always the same: to pull the next weed. He brought the same quality of watchful awareness to his labor. He would feel the rough, wooden handle of the trowel in his palm. He would listen to the scraping sound it made as it dug into the earth. He would smell the rich, loamy scent of the soil he turned over. He would notice the intricate network of roots, the pale, blind earthworms that wriggled away from the sudden light. The work was no longer a chore, a means to an end. The work itself became a form of meditation, a way of being fully present in his body, in this place, in this moment. He learned the language of the garden. He learned to distinguish the tenacious, deep-rooted weeds from the shallow ones that could be pulled with ease. He learned which plants had thorns that would punish a careless hand, and which had soft, pliable stems. He discovered small, resilient herbs that had survived beneath the choking canopy of weeds, plants that the monastery had once used for medicines. He would clear the space around them gently, giving them room to breathe and feel the sun. His body changed. The soft, indoor pallor of a scholar monk was replaced by a healthy brown. His shoulders broadened, and his hands, once smooth, became calloused and strong. He moved with a new economy and confidence, his body learning the rhythms of the work, finding ways to conserve energy, to use leverage instead of brute force. One afternoon, as he was clearing a particularly dense patch of thorny vines, a large, dark shape moved at the edge of the clearing. He froze, his hand still holding the sickle. A wild boar. Its coarse, dark hair matted with mud, its small eyes glinting, had emerged from the forest. It was rooting in the earth just beyond the crumbling wall, its powerful snout tearing at the ground. A year ago, even a month ago, this encounter would have sent a jolt of pure terror through him. The catastrophe story would have taken over instantly. The boar would charge, its tusks would rip him open. He would die here, alone and undiscovered. The instinct to fight or flee would have been overwhelming. Now, something different happened. He felt the initial surge of adrenaline, the familiar tightening in his gut. His heart began to beat faster. He recognized the feeling instantly. Fear is here. He did not react. He did not move. He dropped his anchor. He brought his attention to his breath, which had become shallow and quick. He consciously deepened it. Inhale. Exhale. He kept his eyes on the boar, but his inner gaze was on his own internal state. He watched the wave of fear rise, crest, and then, because he was not feeding it with stories, he felt it begin to recede. The boar had not noticed him. It continued its foraging, grunting softly. Kaito remained perfectly still, a statue in the middle of the garden. He was not its enemy. He was not its prey. He was just another part of the landscape, like a tree or a stone. He watched the powerful, unself-conscious way the animal moved, the sheer force of its presence. There was no anxiety in it, no doubt. It was simply a boar, being a boar. After a few minutes, it ambled back into the shadows of the forest and was gone. Kaito let out a long, slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He was trembling slightly, but the deep, soul-shaking terror was absent. He had faced a real, potential danger, and his practice had held. He had not fought. He had not fled. He had remained still, anchored in the present moment, and the danger had passed. He looked down at the sickle in his hand, then at the quiet space where the boar had been. He understood then that the greatest dangers he faced were not the ones that came from the forest, but the ones that came from his own mind. The boar was just a boar, but the story of the boar, that was the truly ferocious beast. As the weeks turned into months, the garden began to change. The progress was slow, almost imperceptible on a day-to-day basis, but undeniable over time. Small, clear patches of dark soil began to appear in the sea of green. He had repaired a section of the wall, finding the fallen stones and fitting them back into place like pieces of a puzzle. He had pruned the dead branches from the gnarled plum tree, and, to his astonishment, a few small green buds had begun to appear on its living limbs. His inner landscape was changing in parallel. The periods of quiet between his thoughts grew longer. The fearful stories still made their appearances, but they were like old actors on a stage, their performances familiar and lacking their former power to convince him. He could almost smile at them now, with a kind of gentle affection. Ah, the old catastrophe story. I know this one well. He experienced moments of profound peace, a quiet joy that arose from nowhere. It would come as he watched a line of ants marching purposefully across a stone, or as he felt the cool evening breeze on his face after a long day of work. It was not a happiness that depended on anything. It was not the happiness of accomplishment or praise. It was the simple, unadorned joy of being alive, of being present to the world just as it was. He rarely thought about the main monastery. It felt like a world away, a life that belonged to someone else. He had everything he needed here. The garden was his teacher. The weeds were his koans. The breath was his master. One evening, as he was sitting for his second hour of zazen, watching the shadows lengthen and the colors of the world soften into dusk, a new kind of thought arose. It was not a story of fear or a daydream of escape. It was a simple, profound realization. He saw that his entire life had been a struggle against what is. He had struggled against his own anxious nature, trying to force himself to be calm and confident. He had struggled against the expectations of others, trying to be the perfect monk. He had struggled against this garden, seeing it as an obstacle to be overcome. This struggle, this constant resistance to reality, was the root of all his suffering. It was the source of the tension, the exhaustion, the feeling of being at war with himself and the world. And in the quiet of the evening garden, another possibility dawned. What if he just stopped fighting? What if he accepted everything, just as it was? What if he accepted his anxiety, not as a flaw to be fixed, but as a part of his own inner weather? What if he accepted the garden, not as a problem to be solved, but as a place to be? What if he accepted himself, Kaito, the anxious, imperfect monk, exactly as he was in this moment? The thought was so radical, so simple, that it shook him to his core. It was not a resignation to failure. It was a profound act of peace. To lay down his arms, to stop fighting the endless, unwinnable war. He felt a wave of relief so immense that tears began to well in his eyes. They were not tears of sadness or joy, but of a deep, quiet release. He let them fall, tracing warm paths down his dusty cheeks. He did not wipe them away. He just watched the shadow play of his own long-held sorrow. And in the watching, it dissolved, leaving behind only the vast, silent wall of his own peaceful awareness. The sun had set, and in the twilight, the garden was perfectly still. And so was he. The tears subsided, leaving behind a feeling of extraordinary clarity, as if a long smudged lens had been wiped clean. He looked out at the garden, his garden, and saw it with new eyes. He saw not just the work that remained, the vast stretches of unconquered weeds, the other crumbling sections of the wall, but the beauty that was already present. He saw the delicate, lace-like patterns of the fern fronds that grew in the shady corners. He saw the way the fading light caught the silver undersides of the mugwort leaves, making them glow. He saw the stubborn resilience of a single, tiny violet that had pushed its way through a crack in a stone. He had been so focused on what was wrong with the garden, what needed to be fixed, that he had been blind to what was already right. His mind had been a harsh critic, constantly pointing out flaws and imperfections. Now, for the first time, he looked upon the scene with a gaze of simple, unconditional acceptance. The garden was not perfect. It was a chaotic, half-wild place, a mixture of neglect and nascent order. And it was beautiful. This realization rippled outward, touching his perception of himself. He had spent his life focused on his own perceived flaws, his anxiety, his lack of confidence, his feeling of being an imposter. He had believed that if he could just fix these things, eradicate these weeds from his own personality, then he could finally be at peace. Now he saw the futility of that effort. These things were a part of his landscape. Perhaps, like the thorny vines, they had even served a purpose, protecting a more vulnerable part of himself. To be at war with them was to be at war with himself. Peace, he understood with a certainty that resonated in every cell of his body, was not the absence of the storm. It was the acceptance of the storm. It was the ability to find a quiet center, the anchor of the breath, and to let the winds of fear and the waves of anxiety move around him without being swept away. He did not need to become a different person. He just needed to become more fully, more compassionately himself. With this insight, a new quality entered his work. The next day, as he knelt in the soil, his movements were imbued with a sense of tenderness. He was no longer just removing weeds. He was tending. He was caring for this small patch of earth. When he pulled a weed, he did so with a feeling of respect for its life force, its tenacious will to grow. He was not destroying an enemy. He was simply making space for other things to flourish. He began to compost the weeds he pulled, creating a pile in a corner of the garden that would, over time, break down and become rich soil, returning its life to the garden in a new form. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was an enemy. Everything had its place in the great cycle. He began to talk to the plants, soft, quiet words of encouragement as he cleared the space around the medicinal herbs. He would thank the earth for its stability, the sun for its warmth, the rain for its nourishment. This was not a descent into foolishness, but an ascent into a deeper kind of intimacy with the world around him. He was dissolving the boundary between himself and the garden. His hands in the soil were not separate from the soil. His breath was not separate from the air. His work was a form of communion, a conversation between himself and the living world. The shadow play in his mind continued, of course. The old habits of thought were deeply ingrained. The judgment story would still appear, whispering that a real monk would have cleared this whole garden by now. The catastrophe story would still flicker at the edges of his awareness when a snake slithered across a sun-warmed rock. But now, his response was different. He would greet these thoughts with a gentle, inner smile. "Thank you for your concern," he would say to the anxious part of his mind. "I hear you, but for now, I am just going to feel the sun on my back and pull this one weed." He was learning to be his own kind friend. He was learning to parent the frightened child within him, not with harsh discipline or dismissal, but with gentle, unwavering presence. This self-compassion was perhaps the most profound discovery of all. He had sought the approval of his master, of the other monks, of a distant, abstract Buddha. He had never thought to seek the approval of himself. He had never realized that the only acceptance that could truly heal him was his own. One afternoon, a small brown sparrow landed on the handle of his trowel, which he had left sticking in the earth. It chirped brightly, its head cocked, looking at him with a bright black eye. Kaito remained perfectly still, breathing softly. The bird, feeling no threat from this quiet, unmoving human, hopped from the trowel onto a nearby stone and began to preen its feathers. Kaito watched, a feeling of pure, simple delight bubbling up inside him. He was no longer an intruder in this landscape. He was becoming a part of it. The birds and the boars, the weeds and the herbs, the sun and the rain, they were his companions. The silence of the garden was no longer an empty, echoing void. It was a rich, full silence, pregnant with life. It was the silence of home. He sat there, cross-legged in the dirt, a half-pulled weed in his hand, and watched the sparrow until it flew away, leaving behind a silence that was filled with the sound of his own quiet, peaceful heart. Part 5. The Unmoving Mountain in the Storm. The season turned. The long, sun-drenched days of late summer began to shorten, and the air in the mornings carried a new, sharp chill. The sky, which had been a consistent pale blue, now became a canvas for more dramatic moods, with great flotillas of clouds sailing in from the sea, their bellies heavy and grey. Kaito had watched these changes not with apprehension, but with the same quiet, observational curiosity he now brought to everything. The weather of the sky and the weather of his mind were old acquaintances. One afternoon, a strange stillness fell over the garden. The usual chorus of insects fell silent. The birds, which normally flitted and called from the branches of the surrounding pines, had vanished. The air grew heavy, thick and humid, carrying a metallic tang. A strange yellow-green light filtered through the clouds, casting an eerie, unnatural glow on the garden, making the greens of the leaves seem almost fluorescent and the dark soil look black as ink. Kaito, who was on his knees carefully transplanting a small cluster of wild ginger, paused and looked up at the sky. He felt a low, vibrational hum in the air, a sense of immense pressure, as if the world were holding its breath. He had felt this before, not in the sky, but in himself. It was the feeling that came just before a panic attack, that tense, humming silence before the inner storm broke. He recognized it instantly. He straightened up and took a slow, deep breath, letting his awareness settle into his body. He felt the solid ground beneath his knees, the rough texture of the soil on his fingertips. He was anchored. The first gust of wind came not as a gentle breeze, but as a sudden, violent shove. It tore through the clearing with a low moan, thrashing the branches of the plum tree and flattening the tall weeds against the ground. It picked up loose leaves and dust, swirling them into a frantic dance. Kaito's robes whipped around him, the fabrics snapping sharply in the wind. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the force of it, a raw, untamed power. The old voices in his mind, which had been so quiet for so long, began to whisper again, stirred from their slumber by the rising wind. A storm is coming, a bad one. You are exposed here. You are not safe. He opened his eyes. The whispers were there, but they were faint, like voices heard from a great distance. His primary reality was the feeling of the wind on his skin, the sound of it roaring in the pines. He calmly gathered his trowel and sickle and placed them in the small, dilapidated hut he used for shelter and storage. The hut was a flimsy structure of wood and thatch, and he knew it would offer little real protection. The sky grew darker, the yellow light swallowed by a bruised purple-black. Then the rain began. It was not a gentle shower. Fat, heavy drops began to fall, striking the dry earth with audible thuds, raising little puffs of dust. Within moments, the drops merged into a solid, descending sheet of water, a silver curtain that blurred the entire world. The sound was deafening, a relentless drumming on the thatch roof of the hut, a hissing roar as it saturated the garden. Kaito stood just inside the doorway of the hut, watching. The garden was being transformed, washed and battered. The neat patches of soil he had so carefully cleared were turning into muddy pools. The small plants he had been nurturing were being beaten down by the force of the deluge. A part of him, the part that had taken pride in his work, felt a pang of loss. All that effort being washed away. He watched that feeling arise, the shadow of attachment, and let it pass. The garden was not his to control. The rain was not his enemy. It was just the rain. Then came the first crack of thunder. It was not a distant rumble, but a sharp, explosive sound that seemed to rip the sky in two, directly overhead. It was followed instantly by a flash of lightning that bleached the world white for a split second, etching the image of the thrashing trees and the flooded garden onto his vision. The ground itself seemed to tremble with the force of the concussion. This was a different level of intensity. This was primal. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to retreat, to cower in the furthest, darkest corner of the hut, to make himself as small as possible. The catastrophe story, which had become a quiet and infrequent visitor, now returned with the force of the thunder itself. The hut will be struck by lightning. A tree will fall and crush you. The walls will collapse. Flee! Hide! Survive! His heart was pounding, a frantic drum against his ribs. His breath was short and shallow. His palms were sweating. He was face to face with the raw, biological imperative of fight or flight. To fight was impossible. What could he fight? The sky? To flee seemed the only sane option. But where could he go? To run back to the monastery through the forest in a storm like this was madness. To stay in this flimsy hut felt like a death sentence. He was trapped. The two paths, the two primal responses, were both blocked. And in that moment of being utterly trapped, he remembered the third path. The path of the anchor. The path of the unmoving mountain. With a deliberateness that felt like the slowest, most difficult action of his entire life, he turned away from the seeming safety of the hut's interior. He walked out of the doorway and back into the heart of the storm. The rain hit him like a physical blow, instantly plastering his robes to his skin, the cold water streaming down his face and back. The wind tore at him, trying to push him off balance. He walked to the center of the garden, to the small patch of ground near the plum tree that had become his zazen place. The ground was soft mud, and water was pooling around his ankles. He lowered himself to the earth, into the mud and the water, and folded his legs into the familiar posture. He straightened his back. He rested his hands in his lap. He half-closed his eyes. The sensory overload was total. The roar of the wind and rain was a physical pressure on his eardrums. The cold was seeping into his bones. Every few moments, the world would flash white, followed by a gut-shaking explosion of thunder. His body was screaming, a symphony of terror. His mind was a hurricane of catastrophic thoughts. He did not try to stop it. He did not try to find a place of peace. He simply dropped his anchor. He brought his attention to his breath. It was difficult to find. It was a tiny, fragile thread in a universe of chaos. But it was there. He felt the frantic, shallow inhale. He felt the shuddering exhale. He did not try to change it. He just watched it. "The lightning will strike this tree," the mind screamed. He labeled it thinking, and returned to the breath. A wave of pure physical terror washed through his body, making him want to leap up and run. He felt it fully. Fear is here, and returned to the breath. The rain hammered down on his shaven head. The wind howled in his ears. He felt the sensations without resistance. Hearing, feeling, and returned to the breath. Again and again he was swept away. Again and again he returned. He was the small boat, not just in a storm, but in a typhoon. The waves were washing over the deck, the mast was groaning, the sails were torn to shreds. But deep below, the anchor held. It held him to the present moment, to the simple, undeniable reality of his own breathing body, sitting on the earth. An hour passed, or perhaps it was a lifetime. Time had no meaning here. There was only the storm and the breath. And slowly, a profound shift began to take place in his perception. He began to feel the mountain beneath him. Not just the garden, but the entire silent mountain of which the garden was a tiny part. He could feel its immense weight, its deep, stony silence, its unthinkably ancient patience. This mountain had sat here for millions of years. It had endured countless storms, thousands of winters, the heat of 100,000 summers. The storms were not a threat to the mountain. They were just a passing expression of its own nature. The mountain received the rain. It was carved by the wind. It was illuminated by the lightning. But it was not moved. It did not resist. It simply endured. It simply was. And in that moment, the boundary between Kaito and the mountain dissolved. He was no longer a small, frightened monk sitting in the mud. He was the mountain. His spine was the mountain's core. His flesh was the soil and rock. The rain that streamed down his face was the same rain that washed down the mountain's slopes, feeding its streams and rivers. The wind that pushed against his body was the same wind that sculpted the mountain's peaks. He looked out through his half-closed eyes at the storm raging around him, and he saw that it was not separate from the storm that was raging inside him. The roar of the thunder was the same raw, powerful energy as the roar of his fear. The chaotic, lashing rain was the same energy as his frantic, chaotic thoughts. They were not two different things. They were one single, immense expression of life. The storm was not happening to him. It was happening through him. It was a part of him, just as the stillness was a part of him. With this realization, the last vestige of resistance fell away. He stopped being a man enduring a storm. He became the storm itself. He opened himself completely to the experience. He felt the full force of the wind, the full cold of the rain, the full power of the thunder. And he did not flinch. There was no Kaito to be threatened. There was only this wild, terrifying, and exquisitely beautiful moment. He was the unmoving mountain, and he was the raging storm. He was the silent, watchful awareness, and he was the chaotic energy that played within it. He was the anchor, and he was the ocean. A faint smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of happiness or pride. It was a smile of profound, simple recognition. He had spent his life trying to fight or flee the storm, never realizing that he was what he was running from. Freedom was not to be found in a calm sea or a sunny day. Freedom was to be found right here, in the very heart of the typhoon. He sat, unmoving, as the thunder cracked and the lightning flashed, a still point in the center of the turning world, perfectly at peace. The peak of the storm's fury was a timeless, eternal present. Each moment was total. The flash of lightning was not followed by thunder. It was a single, unified event of light and sound that obliterated all thought. The wind was not a series of gusts. It was a continuous, solid river of force. He was utterly immersed. His individual consciousness dissolved into the raw, sensory data of the experience. There was no room for stories, no space for the shadow play. The reality of the moment was too immense, too demanding. He did not know when the change began, but it was as subtle as the turning of a great tide. The thunder, which had been a constant, cracking explosion directly overhead, began to rumble from further away. The sharp, violent reports softened into long, rolling growls that echoed through the valleys. The rain, which had been a solid, blinding sheet, began to lose its density. He could start to distinguish individual drops again and see the dark, blurred shapes of the trees at the edge of the clearing. The wind's relentless screams subsided into a series of long, mournful howls, punctuated by moments of relative quiet. The storm was not ending. It was passing. It was moving on. He watched this process with the same unwavering attention he had given its peak. He did not cling to the intensity, nor did he yearn for the calm. He simply observed the change, the natural ebbing of the great wave of energy. As the rain softened into a steady, vertical drizzle, other sounds began to emerge from beneath the roar. He could hear the gurgle of water as it ran in small rivulets through the garden, carving new paths in the mud. He could hear the dripping of water from the leaves of the plum tree. The world was slowly reassembling itself, its individual voices returning as the storm's monolithic shout faded. His own inner world was reassembling too. The sense of being one with the mountain and the storm began to recede, and the familiar boundaries of his own body returned. He could feel the cold, not as an abstract energy, but as a deep chill in his bones. He could feel the ache in his knees and back from sitting so long in one position. He could feel the uncomfortable weight of his soaked robes. The small, familiar self, with its aches and its needs, was re-emerging from the vast, impersonal experience. But it was a different self. The frantic, anxious energy that had been its constant companion was gone. In its place was a profound stillness, a silence that was not empty but full. It was the silence of the deep earth after a soaking rain. He felt scoured, washed clean from the inside out. The layers of subtle tension he had carried in his muscles for years had been released. The deep grooves of his habitual thoughts had been smoothed over. He remained seated as the last of the storm clouds drifted away to the east, their dark bases lit from below by the unseen, setting sun. A sliver of clear turquoise sky appeared on the western horizon. The rain stopped, and in the wake of the storm, a silence descended upon the garden that was unlike any silence he had ever known. It was not the absence of sound. The world was filled with the sound of dripping water, a million tiny liquid bells. But it was a silence of the mind, a complete cessation of the inner chatter. He opened his eyes fully. The air was crystalline, washed clean of all dust and haze. A single, brilliant beam of the setting sun broke through a gap in the clouds, striking the garden and setting it ablaze with light. Every wet leaf, every blade of grass, every glistening stone was edged with gold. The puddles of water in the mud reflected the clearing sky like perfect, shattered mirrors. A rainbow, impossibly vibrant, arched across the entire sky. Its colors so pure and intense, they seemed to hum with energy. The beauty of it was so overwhelming, so unexpected, that it brought a fresh wave of tears to his eyes. But these were not the tears of release he had shed before. These were tears of gratitude. He felt a love for the world that was so powerful, it was a physical ache in his chest. A love for the storm that had just passed, for the rain, for the mud he was sitting in, for the broken plants and the gnarled, dripping tree. He saw that the storm had not been an ordeal to be survived. It had been a gift, a fierce, terrifying, and profoundly clarifying gift. It had washed away not just the dust from the leaves, but the dust from his own heart. It had shown him that his true nature was not the small, frightened self that cowered in the hut, but the vast, unmoving mountain that could hold the entirety of the storm without breaking. He finally, slowly, moved. He placed his muddy palms on the wet earth and pushed himself up, his limbs stiff and protesting. He stood, dripping and shivering, in the middle of the transformed garden. He looked at the ruin the storm had left. A large branch had been torn from one of the pines at the edge of the clearing. The section of wall he had so carefully rebuilt had partially collapsed. Many of the small herbs he had been tending were washed away or buried in mud. The old Kaito would have seen this as a disaster, a confirmation of the futility of his efforts. But he felt no despair. He felt no frustration. He saw it simply as what was. The garden was not a static thing to be perfected. It was a living, dynamic process, constantly being shaped by the forces of nature. His work was not to impose a permanent order upon it, but to participate in its constant unfolding. He would rebuild the wall again. He would find new herbs to plant. His work was not a battle against chaos, but a dance with it. He walked to the hut, his feet sinking into the soft mud. He stripped off his cold, wet robes and washed himself as best he could with the collected rainwater. He put on his spare, dry robe, the rough, clean fabric a comfort against his skin. He felt a deep, simple hunger. He ate a small rice ball he had saved, and it was the most delicious food he had ever tasted. As darkness fell, he did not light a lamp. He sat in the doorway of his hut, looking out at the garden under a sky now filled with a brilliant spray of stars, clearer and brighter than he had ever seen them. He was not afraid of the dark. He was not afraid of the sounds of the night. He was not afraid of the thoughts in his own mind. He had met the greatest fear, the fear of annihilation, and had discovered that there was nothing there to be annihilated. There was only the breath, the mountain, the storm, and the great silent awareness that held it all. He was home. He had always been home. He had just never known it. Part 6. The Great Silence After the Rain. Kaito awoke not to a sound, but to a quality of light. A soft, pearlescent glow was filtering through the thin paper of the hut's small window, a light that seemed to have been washed clean of all color and returned to its purest essence. He lay for a long moment on his simple sleeping mat, his body feeling heavy and deeply settled, as if the storm had pressed him more firmly into the earth. The usual morning fog of anxiety, the subtle gray mist of worries that typically greeted him upon waking, was entirely absent. In its place was a profound and unfamiliar silence. It was not the silence of emptiness he had once feared, the vast, echoing void that amplified his own inner noise. This was a different kind of silence altogether. It was full, resonant, and alive. It was the silence of a bell just after it has been struck, the vibration still humming in the air, a presence more palpable than sound itself. He could feel this silence in the room, in his own body, in the very marrow of his bones. It was the great silence after the rain. He rose slowly, his movements fluid and unhurried. Every part of his body ached with a deep, satisfying weariness, the feeling of muscles that had been worked to their limit and are now in a state of profound release. He slid open the wooden door of the hut and stepped out into the dawn. The world was born anew. The air was so clear and clean it felt like drinking pure, cold water. It carried the rich, complex scent of the forest after a storm, the sharp fragrance of pine needles, the deep, loamy smell of wet earth, the faint, electric tang of ozone left behind by the lightning. Every surface glistened, coated in a shimmering layer of moisture. A million tiny diamonds of water clung to the leaves, the stones, and the delicate threads of a spider's web that had miraculously survived the tempest. He looked upon the garden, and he did not see destruction. He saw transformation. The storm had not been a malevolent force, but a powerful, impartial artist. It had rearranged the landscape. The large pine branch that had fallen lay across a patch of weeds like a calligrapher's bold, final stroke. The collapsed section of the wall had a new, organic shape. The stones tumbled into a gentle slope. The rivulets and pools of water that dotted the clearing were not signs of flooding, but mirrors, each one holding a perfect, miniature reflection of the soft, grey and rose-coloured sky. He felt no urge to immediately begin fixing, to start imposing his own order on this new reality. The desire to control, to struggle against what is, had been washed out of him. Instead, a feeling of deep acceptance and even curiosity flowed through him. This was the garden now. This was the new starting point. He walked barefoot into the clearing, the soft, cool mud squelching between his toes. The sensation was not unpleasant. It was grounding, a direct and intimate connection to the earth. He walked to the center of the garden and performed a slow, standing bow, not to a Buddha, not to a master, but to the garden itself, to the storm that had passed, to the morning. to the simple, astonishing fact of being alive. His work that day was different from all the days that had come before. He did not begin with a plan, with a sense of a task to be accomplished. He simply began where he was. He saw a small, delicate fern that had been crushed by a piece of fallen stone. He knelt in the mud, his movements gentle and deliberate. He carefully lifted the stone, feeling its weight and texture, and placed it to the side. He then used his fingers to tenderly straighten the bruised fronds of the fern, propping it up with a small twig. He was not saving the plant. He was simply offering it a small assistance, a gesture of care. The outcome was not his concern. The act of tending was everything. He spent the morning in this way, moving through the garden in a slow, meandering dance. He cleared a channel for a large pool of water to drain away, not with frantic digging, but by removing one small stone at a time, watching how the water responded, how it found its own natural path. He gathered the smaller fallen branches and leaves, not seeing them as debris to be discarded, but as future nourishment for the soil. He began a new compost pile, laying the storm's offerings down in a careful, respectful way. His mind, for the first time in his life, was a quiet and willing partner in his work. The inner narrator, the voice that commented, judged, and worried, had fallen silent. There was only the sensation of the cool mud, the sight of the green leaves, the sound of the dripping water. He was completely absorbed in the present moment, his awareness fused with his actions. This, he realized, was the true meaning of work in a monastery. It was not about achieving results. It was not about efficiency or productivity. It was about presence. It was meditation in motion. Around midday, as the sun finally broke through the clouds, warming his back, he came to the collapsed section of the wall. He looked at the jumble of stones. The old Kaito would have felt a wave of despair, seeing weeks of hard work undone in a single night. But the new Kaito felt only a quiet sense of purpose. The wall had fallen. Now he would build it again. He picked up a single stone. It was heavy, and its surface was slick with rain and algae. He felt its solidity, its ancientness. This stone had been here long before him and would be here long after he was gone. He was just a temporary custodian. He found the place where it seemed to fit, where its unique, irregular shape nested against the other stones. He settled it into place, feeling the satisfying thud as it found its home. He had not rebuilt the wall. He had placed one stone. And that was enough. He picked up another. This slow, patient work became a profound teaching. He saw that the wall was not just an outer structure. It was a reflection of his own inner practice. Each stone, carefully chosen and placed, was like a moment of returning to the breath. It was a small act of building stability, of creating a container for his life. The storm could come and knock it down, but the stones would always remain. The practice of rebuilding was always available. The strength was not in the permanence of the wall, but in the willingness to build it again and again, with patience and without despair. As he worked, he noticed a hollow in one of the larger, unfallen stones of the wall. It had filled with rainwater, creating a small, perfectly still pool, no bigger than his two hands. He paused his work and knelt before it. The water was crystal clear. In its surface, the entire world was reflected with breathtaking clarity. He could see the brilliant blue of the sky, the sharp white edges of a passing cloud, the dark green of the pine trees, and the intricate crisscrossing pattern of their branches. He leaned closer and saw his own face reflected there. It was a face he barely recognized. The familiar mask of tension, the slight furrow in his brow, the tightness around his mouth, it was all gone. The face in the water was calm, open, and serene. It was the face of a stranger, and it was his own true face. He saw that his mind, like this pool of water, had finally become still. The storm of his thoughts and fears had churned it into a muddy, agitated state, incapable of reflecting anything but its own turmoil. But now that the storm had passed and the sediment had settled, it could reflect the world exactly as it was, in all its simple, profound beauty. He stayed there for a long time, gazing into the small pool, not in an act of vanity, but in an act of deep recognition. He understood that the peace he had been seeking was not something to be acquired or achieved. It was his natural state. It was the clarity of the water that is always present when the mud is allowed to settle. His practice was not about creating peace, but about ceasing to disturb it. It was about letting go of the struggle, the resistance, the constant churning, and allowing his own true nature, which was stillness itself, to emerge. The sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. He placed the last stone for the day and washed his hands in the cool, clear water of the pool. He had not finished the wall. He had not even finished half of it. But his heart was filled with a deep and quiet satisfaction. He returned to his hut and sat for his evening meditation. He did not sit with a goal or an intention. He did not sit to calm his mind or to watch his breath. He simply sat. He assumed the posture, and he rested. He rested in the great silence that had begun in the morning and had continued throughout the day. He rested in the feeling of his body, tired and alive. He rested in the sounds of the evening garden, the first tentative chirps of the crickets, the gentle sigh of the breeze. There was no separation between himself and the world. His breath was the breath of the wind. The beating of his heart was the gentle rhythm of the earth. The stillness in his mind was the stillness of the stones and the stars. He was not a monk meditating in a garden. He was the garden, meditating. He was a small, quiet part of the world, simply being itself. And in this simple, profound state of being, he found a relaxation so deep, so complete, that it felt like coming home. The long journey from anxiety to stillness had led him here, to this quiet, peaceful shore. He was at rest. As he sat in the deepening twilight, the boundaries of his physical form seemed to soften and dissolve. The distinction between the air outside his body and the breath within it faded. The cool evening air was not something he was drawing in. It was simply flowing through a space that happened to be called Kaito. The sounds of the crickets were not external events registered by his ears. They were vibrations arising within the vast, silent field of his own awareness. This was not a philosophical idea or a mystical vision. It was a simple, direct, felt experience. The sense of a separate I, a small self locked inside a body, observing a world out there, had become transparent, almost non-existent. In this state of open, boundless presence, memories arose. But they were not the sharp, painful memories of the past, laden with regret or shame. They floated up gently, like bubbles rising through clear water, and they were imbued with a new quality of understanding and compassion. He saw himself as a small boy in his father's workshop, holding the splintered piece of wood. But now, he did not feel the sting of failure. He felt a deep, tender compassion for that small, earnest boy who was trying so hard. He saw the boy's frustration, his disappointment, his desperate desire for his father's approval. And he saw his father, not as a harsh judge, but as a man who was himself bound by his own limitations, a man who did not have the words to express love or encouragement, who knew only the language of perfection and utility. He saw two people, a father and a son, caught in a silent, shared suffering, each unable to reach the other. There was no blame, only a profound, aching sadness, and a boundless sense of forgiveness that washed over the memory, cleansing it of its old pain. He saw himself as a young novice, newly arrived at the monastery, his mind a frantic hive of ambition and fear. He had been so desperate to be a good monk, to get it right. He had measured himself against the serene, silent figures of the senior monks, and had found himself wanting in every respect. He had believed their stillness was a permanent attainment, a state they had achieved through heroic effort, and he had despaired at his own restless, noisy mind. Now, he saw with a gentle, humorous clarity that their stillness was not an achievement, it was a surrender. They had simply, over many years of practice, given up the fight. They had laid down their arms, just as he had been forced to do in the heart of the storm. Their peace was not the result of winning a war, but of realizing the war itself was an illusion. He understood that Master Kenji had not sent him to the garden as a punishment or a test he was meant to fail. He had sent him to a place where the conditions were perfect for him to finally exhaust himself. In the structured, supportive environment of the main monastery, Kaito could have continued for years, hiding his anxiety behind a mask of diligence, his inner storm buffered by the thick walls of routine and community. But here, in the solitude of the garden, he had been left with no distractions, no one to perform for, nothing to lean on. He had been left alone with himself, with his own mind, until the confrontation was inevitable. The master had not given him a problem to solve. He had given him a mirror. The ruined garden was a perfect, unflinching reflection of his own inner state, and the instruction to tend it was the most compassionate teaching of all. It was an invitation not to fix himself, but to simply be with himself, to care for his own chaotic, neglected inner world with the same patience and tenderness one would offer to a piece of wounded earth. A deep sense of gratitude toward his master bloomed in his heart. It was a gratitude free of the old undertones of fear and the desire for approval. It was the simple, clean gratitude of a student for a teacher who had trusted him enough to let him find his own way, even if that way led through terror and despair. The master's silence, his seeming indifference, had been the greatest teaching. He had refused to engage with Kaito's drama, refused to play the role of savior or judge, and in doing so, had forced Kaito to find his own anchor, his own mountain. He had taught him not by giving him answers, but by creating the space for Kaito to become the answer himself. The moon, nearly full, rose above the dark silhouette of the pines, flooding the garden with a soft, silver light. Kaito's sitting period had ended long ago, but he felt no need to move. He was completely at rest. His body and mind settled into a state of equilibrium. He was awake, alert, and yet profoundly relaxed. It was a state he had never imagined possible. He had always associated wakefulness with tension, and relaxation with a dull, sleepy state. This was something new. It was a vibrant, energized calm, a peaceful aliveness. He thought of the endless cycles of his own past suffering. The pattern had always been the same. A fearful thought would arise. He would believe it, identify with it. This belief would create a painful emotion, anxiety, dread, shame. To escape the painful emotion, he would either fight, by trying to suppress the thought, arguing with it, criticizing himself for having it, or flee, by distracting himself, seeking reassurance, or fantasizing about escape. This reaction, this resistance, was the fuel that kept the fire of suffering burning. It was a closed loop, a self-perpetuating cycle of misery. The storm had broken that cycle. It had presented him with a situation so overwhelming that his usual strategies of fight or flight were useless. It had forced him into the third path, stillness. And in that stillness, he had discovered the secret. The secret was to feel the fear without becoming the fear. To let the thoughts come and go without believing they were the truth. To allow the painful emotions to be present in his body without resisting them or being swept away by them. It was to simply rest in the vast, open space of awareness and let the weather of the mind pass through. It was so simple. And yet it had taken him a lifetime of suffering to discover it. He lay down on his mat, pulling a thin blanket over him. He did not fall into a heavy, unconscious sleep. Instead, he felt himself drifting in a gentle, liminal state between waking and sleeping. His awareness remained clear and bright, but his body was sinking into a profound state of rest. The sounds of the night, the chirping of the crickets, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of a small animal in the undergrowth were not disturbances. They were a lullaby, the gentle, rhythmic breathing of the world around him. He was not a separate being trying to fall asleep in a noisy world. He was part of that world, and its rhythms were his own. He felt safe, held, and deeply, deeply peaceful. The great silence after the rain had settled not just over the garden, but over his own heart. And in that silence, he finally, truly, rested. Part 7. Tending the Soil of the Mind. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, luminous joy. The dramatic peak of the storm and the profound stillness that followed had given way to a steady, gentle state of being that Kaito had never known. The world had not changed. The garden was still a chaotic mix of wildness and nascent order. The work was still hard. The solitude was still absolute. But his relationship to it had been fundamentally transformed. He no longer felt like he was in a battle with the garden, but in a partnership. He was not its conqueror, but its caretaker. His work became a seamless extension of his meditation. The boundary between sitting on his cushion and kneeling in the soil dissolved. Both were practices of presence, of paying gentle, non-judgmental attention to what was arising in the moment. When he sat, he watched the thoughts and feelings that grew in the soil of his mind. When he worked, he tended the plants that grew in the soil of the earth. The inner and outer landscapes were reflections of each other, and the principles for tending them were the same. He learned to see his thoughts as different kinds of plants. The old, recurring stories of fear and inadequacy were like the deep-rooted, thorny vines that tried to choke everything else out. For years, he had tried to fight them by hacking at their leaves, a futile effort that only seemed to make them grow back stronger. Now, he understood that he had to go deeper. When a familiar, anxious thought pattern arose, he would pause his work, close his eyes for a moment, and drop his anchor. He would feel the breath, and from that place of stillness, he would investigate the root of the thought. Where did it come from? What belief was it feeding on? What was the deep, underlying fear it was trying to protect him from? He would sit with the fear, not as an enemy, but as a frightened child. He would breathe into the physical sensation of it in his body, the tightness in his chest, the knot in his stomach, and offer it a silent, compassionate acceptance. He was not trying to make it go away. He was simply offering it a safe space to be. And in this space of gentle, unwavering attention, fear would slowly begin to lose its power. Its roots would loosen their grip. Like a weed whose taproot has been gently worked free from the soil, the thought pattern could then be lifted out, not with violence, but with care, and placed on the compost pile of his awareness, where its energy could be transformed into something more nourishing. Other thoughts were like the shallow-rooted, opportunistic weeds that spring up everywhere. These were the small judgments, the fleeting moments of impatience, the minor complaints about the heat or the insects. He learned not to make a big deal of them. He would simply notice them. Complaining. And, with a light touch, pluck them out and return his focus to the task at hand. He saw that giving them too much attention was like watering them. They would only multiply. The key was a gentle, consistent weeding, a moment-to-moment practice of clearing the mental space so that more wholesome states could grow. And they did. As he cleared the soil of his mind, he discovered that there were other seeds buried there, seeds he had never noticed before, seeds of kindness, of gratitude, of simple joy. He began to intentionally nurture these. When he saw the vibrant color of a wildflower, he would pause and allow the feeling of beauty to fully permeate his awareness. He would savor it, water it with his attention. When he felt the satisfaction of placing a stone perfectly in the wall, he would let the feeling of quiet accomplishment settle in his body, without letting it inflate his ego. He was cultivating a garden of wholesome states, not by forcing them to grow, but by creating the conditions for them to emerge naturally. His physical work in the garden mirrored this inner process perfectly. He was no longer just clearing the land, he was actively cultivating it. He found a small patch of earth that received the perfect amount of morning sun and began to prepare it for planting. He worked the soil, removing the stones and the last of the weed roots, mixing in the rich, dark humus from his new compost pile. The work was slow and loving. He felt the life in the soil, the energy of potential. He had no seeds to plant, but the forest provided. He learned to identify the edible and medicinal plants that grew wild at the edge of the clearing. He would carefully dig up a small specimen, making sure to get the entire root ball, and transplant it into his prepared bed. He brought back wild mint, chamomile, and yarrow. He found a patch of wild strawberries and moved them to a sunny spot along the inside of the wall. Each act of transplanting was done with a mindful reverence, a silent wish for the plant to thrive in its new home. He talked to the plants as he worked, not with words, but with the quality of his attention. He learned to read their subtle language. He could see when a plant was thirsty by the slight curl of its leaves, or when it needed more sun by the way it leaned toward the light. Tending them became a deep, intuitive conversation, a relationship of mutual care. In nourishing the garden, he felt himself being nourished. In giving his attention to these living things, his own life felt more vibrant, more meaningful. One day, he was working on the far side of the clearing, a place he had not yet touched. The weeds here were waist-high, a dense, tangled thicket. As he was carefully scything a path, he uncovered a stone he had not seen before. It was flat and dark, and there was something unusual about it. He cleared the remaining weeds from around it and saw that it was a Jizo statue, a small stone carving of the Bodhisattva who protects travelers and children. It was old, the features worn smooth by countless seasons of wind and rain. It was covered in a cloak of green moss, and a small, delicate fern grew from a crack in its shoulder. Kaito knelt before the statue, his heart filled with a sense of wonder and connection. Someone else had been here, long ago. Another monk, perhaps, who had also tended this garden, who had also found solace in this quiet, forgotten place. He was not the first. He was part of a lineage, a long, unbroken chain of hands that had worked this soil, of hearts that had sought stillness on this mountain. The feeling of solitude, which had once been a source of fear, now transformed into a feeling of profound communion with all those who had walked this path before him. He did not try to clean the statue. He saw that the moss and the fern were not defacements. They were a part of its beauty, a sign of its deep integration with the life of the garden. The stone was no longer just stone. It was a living collaboration between human artifice and the patient, persistent forces of nature. He simply cleared the space around the statue, creating a small, open area. He swept the ground with a branch and placed a single, perfect wildflower at the statue's base. It was not an act of worship to a deity. It was a gesture of respect, of gratitude, of acknowledging his connection to this place and its history. The discovery of the Jizo marked another shift in his practice. The garden was no longer just a metaphor for his mind. It was a sacred space, a place of deep practice and connection. His work took on a more ceremonial quality. The simple act of sweeping the path to the Jizo each morning became a ritual of clearing the path of his own heart. The act of placing a flower at its base was a daily reminder to offer beauty and kindness to the world. He realized that enlightenment was not a distant, superhuman goal to be achieved in the future. It was here, now, in these simple, ordinary acts. It was in the feeling of the sun on his back. It was in the patient placing of one stone upon another. It was in the gentle removal of a weed. It was in the offering of a single flower to a moss-covered stone. Peace was not a destination. It was the way he walked the path. His body, his mind, and the garden were slowly, patiently, becoming one. The rhythm of his breath matched the slow, steady pulse of the seasons. The stillness in his mind mirrored the deep, quiet strength of the ancient stones. The compassion he felt for the small, struggling plants was the same compassion he now felt for the fearful, struggling parts of himself. He had been sent here to bring a garden back to life, but in the process, he had discovered that the garden was bringing him back to life. He was not just tending the soil of the earth. He was tending the rich, fertile, and sacred soil of his own being. And in this soil, watered by mindfulness and warmed by the sun of compassion, something beautiful and resilient had finally begun to grow. The seasons continued their slow, graceful turn. The vibrant greens of summer softened into the golds, russets, and deep crimsons of autumn. The air grew crisp, and the quality of the light changed, becoming lower, softer, casting long, elegant shadows across the garden in the late afternoon. Kaito's work shifted with the season. The frantic growth of the weeds slowed, and his focus turned from clearing to preparing. He gathered the fallen leaves of the great maple and pine trees, adding their rich, colorful bounty to his compost pile, a promise of future fertility. He carefully mulched the beds where his transplanted herbs grew, protecting their roots from the coming cold. His life had found a deep and satisfying rhythm, a harmony between inner practice and outer action. He had become a creature of the garden, as much a part of its ecosystem as the crickets and the sparrows. He knew its moods, its subtle shifts. He knew where the first frost would touch and which corners held the last of the day's warmth. This intimacy with the natural world fostered a profound sense of belonging. He was not a human imposing his will upon nature. He was a human in conversation with it. One morning, he awoke to a world transformed by the first hard frost. Every surface was coated in a delicate, crystalline layer of white. The remaining leaves on the plum tree, the blades of grass, the intricate webs of the spiders, all were edged in silver, sparkling in the cold, clear light of the rising sun. The beauty was so sharp, so exquisite, it took his breath away. He walked through this silent, glittering world with a sense of reverence. He saw that the frost was not an agent of death, but of transformation. It was a necessary part of the cycle, a signal for the world to draw its energy inward, to rest, to gather strength for the renewal of spring. He saw this same cycle reflected in his own practice. There were periods of vibrant growth, like the summer, where insights bloomed and his practice felt effortless and joyful. And there were periods of frost, where his mind felt barren, where his meditations were dry and distracted, where the old patterns of thought seemed to encase everything in a cold layer of doubt. In the past, he would have despaired during these times, seeing them as a sign of failure, a regression. Now he understood them as a spiritual autumn, a time for turning inward, for resting in the simple, unadorned practice of just sitting, just breathing, without expecting any beautiful flowers or delicious fruit. He learned to trust the process, to know that even in the barrenness of winter, the seeds of spring were dormant, waiting. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, he spent more time in his small hut. He repaired the thatch roof, weaving in new straw to make it watertight. He patched the cracks in the walls with a mixture of mud and grass. He made his small home a refuge, a place of warmth and simple comfort. In the evenings, by the light of a single candle, he began to practice mending. He had only 2 robes, and both were worn thin in places, frayed at the sleeves and hem. He had a small sewing kit, and with meticulous, mindful stitches, he began to repair them. The act of mending became another profound teaching. Each stitch was an act of care. He was not just fixing a hole, he was honoring the robe, extending its life, showing gratitude for its service. He saw that this was the same work he was doing with his mind. He was not trying to throw away his old, torn personality and get a new one. He was gently, patiently mending the worn places, patching the holes of fear and self-judgment with the strong thread of mindfulness and the soft cloth of self-compassion. The mended places, he noticed, were often stronger than the original fabric. His past wounds, his anxieties, when met with this kind of gentle attention, were not weaknesses. They were places of strength, of deeper understanding, of greater compassion for the suffering of others. One afternoon, as a cold, steady rain drummed on his newly repaired roof. He sat mending the knee of his work robe. He was completely absorbed in the simple, repetitive motion, the needle piercing the cloth, the thread pulling taut, the two edges of the tear drawing together. In this state of deep concentration, a memory of Master Kenji arose. It was the memory of their first meeting, when Kaito had arrived at the monastery, a boy of 16, his mind a turbulent sea of hope and terror. He remembered the master serving him a cup of tea. He remembered the way Kenji's hands had held the simple, rustic bowl, with a reverence and a focused attention that had made the act seem as important as any sacred ritual. He had not understood it then. He had been waiting for a lecture, for words of wisdom. But the teaching had not been in words. The teaching had been in the way the master held the cup. Now, sitting in his hut, holding his own worn robe, Kaito finally understood. The master's entire life was a practice of mending, of tending. Tending to the tea, tending to the monastery, tending to the troubled heart of a young novice. It was all one and the same, a continuous act of mindful, compassionate care. The master's silent gaze had not been a judgment. It had been an act of profound attention. He had simply held Kaito in his awareness, just as he held the teacup, creating a space of such deep, unconditional acceptance that Kaito's own defenses had finally been able to fall away. Kaito put down his sewing. He felt a deep, quiet connection to his teacher, a sense of understanding that went far beyond words. He saw that the master had not given him a task to complete, but a path to walk. The garden was a microcosm of that path. It was a place to learn how to hold a teacup, how to mend a robe, how to place one stone upon another, how to tend to the soil of one's own heart. The rain stopped, and a pale, watery sunlight filtered through the clouds. Kaito stepped outside. The air was fresh and cold. He looked at his garden, his home. He saw the rebuilt wall, stronger in its mended places. He saw the mulched beds, the sleeping herbs tucked in for the winter. He saw the moss-covered jizo, a quiet, patient presence. He saw the gnarled plum tree, its bare branches stark against the gray sky, a perfect image of resilience and endurance. He had arrived here seeing only ruin, chaos, and an impossible task. He had looked upon this place with the eyes of fear. Now, he looked upon the same scene with the eyes of love, and he saw not ruin, but a profound and rugged beauty. He saw a place of healing, of transformation, of deep, quiet life. The garden had not changed. He had. And in that change, the whole world was made new. He pressed his palms together and bowed, not to the east or to the west, but to the sacred ground right here beneath his feet, the ground that had taught him everything. Part 8. The Sound of the Wind in the Pines. Winter arrived in earnest, draping the mountain in a thick blanket of silence and snow. The vibrant colors of autumn were a distant memory, the world reduced to a simple, elegant palette of white, black, and gray. The snow softened every sharp edge, rounded every contour, and muffled every sound. The garden became a place of deep, profound stillness, a landscape of minimalist beauty. The stone walls were capped with pillows of white. The bare branches of the plum tree were traced in intricate patterns of frost, and the jizo statue wore a soft, white cap, its stone face serene and untroubled by the cold. Kaito's life turned further inward. His days were no longer filled with the vigorous work of clearing and planting. The earth was sleeping, and he honored its rest. His work now was the simple, quiet work of maintenance, of survival. He would rise in the cold darkness before dawn, his breath pluming in the air of the small hut. His first task was always to clear a path, sweeping the freshly fallen snow from the doorway to the jizo, and from there to the small stream that now ran partially frozen at the edge of the clearing. These simple, repetitive actions, the rhythmic scrape of his broom, the crunch of his sandals on the snow, were his morning sutra, a moving meditation that brought him into harmony with the stark beauty of the winter world. He spent long hours in zazen, his body wrapped in his mended robes and a thick blanket. The cold was a powerful teacher. It demanded a deep, unwavering focus. To let his mind wander was to become aware of the chill seeping into his bones. But to rest in the breath, to settle into the quiet center of his being, was to discover an inner warmth, a subtle energy that was independent of the external temperature. He learned to welcome the cold, to see it not as an antagonist, but as a force that sharpened his awareness, that stripped away all but the most essential reality of the present moment. In the long, dark evenings, he would read by the light of his candle, but his reading was different now. He had brought a few scrolls with him from the monastery library, the classic texts of the great masters. In the past, he had read them with an anxious, grasping mind, trying to extract their meaning, to solve their riddles, to find the secret key to enlightenment. He had read them as a student preparing for an examination. Now, he read them as a friend listening to the voice of another friend. He would read a single line, "The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences," and then he would close the scroll and simply sit with the words, letting them sink into him, not as an idea to be understood, but as a truth to be felt. He did not seek to understand the words. He sought to let the words understand him. One afternoon, as a light snow was falling, soft and silent, he was standing by the stream, breaking a thin layer of ice to collect water. He paused, his bucket half full, and listened. The world was utterly silent, save for the gentle hiss of the falling snow and the soft gurgle of the water flowing beneath the ice. And then another sound reached him, a sound that was so much a part of the landscape that he often failed to notice it. It was the sound of the wind, high up in the great pine trees that ringed the clearing. It was not the violent howl of the storm, but a low, deep, resonant sigh, a sound that seemed to be the very breath of the mountain itself. He stood perfectly still and just listened. He let the sound wash over him, through him. He followed its long, slow rhythm, its rising and falling tones. It was a sound that was ancient, timeless, and profoundly peaceful. It spoke of a patience and an endurance that was beyond all human comprehension. The pines had been singing this same song for centuries, to the sun and the moon, to the summer heat and the winter snow, long before he was born, and they would continue to sing it long after he was gone. He was so absorbed in the sound that he did not hear the soft crunch of footsteps on the snow behind him. "The song is very old today, is it not?" The voice was quiet, calm, and deeply familiar. Kaito turned, his heart giving a single, strong beat of surprise, but not of alarm. Master Kenji stood a few feet away, his simple brown robes a stark contrast to the white of the snow. He held a long wooden staff, and his eyebrows and the shoulders of his robe were dusted with white flakes. He looked not like an intruder, but like a natural part of the winter landscape, a figure that had emerged from the silence itself. Kaito placed his palms together and bowed deeply. "Master." Kenji returned the bow with a slight inclination of his head. His eyes, clear and bright in the cold air, took in the scene. The cleared paths, the sleeping garden under its blanket of snow, the mended hut. There was no expression of praise or criticism in his gaze, only a quiet, open awareness. "It seems the garden is resting well," he said.
"Yes, master,"
Kaito replied.
"Winter has asked it to be still."
The master nodded. He looked up at the tall pines, his head tilted, as if listening intently. "The wind in the pines," he said, more to himself than to Kaito. "1,000 poets have tried to write of it. 1,000 monks have tried to meditate on it. But the sound itself is always new." They stood together in a comfortable silence for a long time, sharing the experience of listening. The snow continued to fall, weaving a soft, white curtain around them. Kaito felt no need to speak, to explain, to justify the months of his work. The garden itself was his report, and the stillness in his own heart was his final answer. He felt a simple, profound sense of peace in his teacher's presence, the easy comfort of two people who understand each other without the need for words. Finally, the master turned his gaze from the trees to Kaito. His eyes were not the vast, empty mirrors of their last encounter. They were warm and direct, yet they held a deep, playful glint, the look of a man about to pose a riddle. "Kaito," he said, his voice quiet but clear, cutting through the hiss of the snow. "You have been listening to the wind in the pines. Tell me, what is the sound of the wind when you are not here to hear it?" The question dropped into the silence of Kaito's mind like a stone into a perfectly still pool of water. It was a koan, a question designed not to be answered by the logical, thinking mind, but to be penetrated by the whole of one's being. The old Kaito would have panicked. His mind would have raced, frantically searching for the right answer, a clever, philosophical response that would impress the master. He would have seen it as a test, another opportunity to fail. He would have become entangled in a web of concepts. Does sound exist if no one is there to perceive it? What is the nature of reality? What is the relationship between subject and object? But Kaito's mind did not race. It did not grasp. It simply received the question, and it became very, very still. He did not try to think of an answer. He looked at his master. He looked at the falling snow, looked at the dark, silent trunks of the great pines. And he listened. He listened not just with his ears, but with his whole body. He listened to the sound of the wind, that deep, resonant sigh. He listened to the silence that held the sound. He listened to the feeling of the cold air on his face. He listened to the steady, quiet rhythm of his own breath. The question was not a puzzle to be solved. It was a doorway. What is the sound of the wind when you are not here to hear it? The question was pointing to the you. Who is this you that hears? This Kaito, this small, separate self with his history, his fears, his hopes. When this small self is not here, what is left? In the profound stillness of the winter afternoon, Kaito let the small self fall away. He let go of the need to answer, the need to know, the need to be right. He let go of Kaito. And in that letting go, there was only the listening. There was no listener and no sound being listened to. There was just listening. The wind, the pines, the snow, the breath. They were all one seamless, unified event. The sound of the wind was not separate from the silence. The hearing was not separate from the sound. A slow smile spread across Kaito's face. It was a smile of pure, unburdened delight. The smile of a man who has just understood the punchline of a cosmic joke. He did not offer a clever verbal response. He did not try to explain his insight. Instead, he did the only thing that felt true. He raised his hands, still wet and cold from the stream, and he gently, mindfully, brushed the snow from his master's shoulders. It was a simple, ordinary gesture, an act of care, an act of presence. But in the context of the master's question, it was a perfect answer. It was an answer that came not from his head, but from his heart. It was an answer that said, "When I am not here, there is only this moment, this action, this simple, selfless tending." Master Kenji's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, and then a deep, warm smile spread across his own face, mirroring Kaito's. He did not say, "You have understood." He did not say, "That is the right answer." He simply placed his own hand on Kaito's shoulder for a moment, a gesture of profound, silent confirmation. He then turned and began to walk back the way he had come, his staff making soft thuds in the fresh snow. He did not look back. He did not say goodbye. The visit was over. Kaito stood and watched until his master's figure was a small, dark shape that finally disappeared into the swirling snow. He was alone again. But he did not feel alone. He felt a connection to his teacher, to the pines, to the wind, that was deeper than mere presence. He turned back to his bucket of water, his heart so full it felt like it might overflow. He had been asked a question about the nature of reality, and the answer had been found in the simplest act of kindness. The great wisdom was not hidden in a distant, transcendent realm. It was right here, in the cold water, in the falling snow, in the gentle brushing of a hand. He picked up his bucket and walked back to his hut, and the sound of the wind in the pines seemed to be singing his name. He carried the bucket of water back to the hut, his steps light on the snow. The world seemed to vibrate with a new intensity, a silent hum of aliveness. The master's visit, and the koan he had left behind, had not been a test, but an initiation. It had opened a door in his perception, a door that led from a conceptual understanding of stillness to a direct, lived experience of non-duality. He placed the bucket down and prepared a small fire in his brazier. As he arranged the charcoal and coaxed the flame to life, his movements were imbued with a deep sense of ceremony. Every action felt complete in itself, not a means to an end. The scraping of the flint, the smell of the smoke, the first flicker of orange light, each was a universe of sensory experience. The master's question echoed not in his mind, but in his cells. What is the sound of the wind when you are not here to hear it? The answer was in the way the fire took hold of the charcoal. It was in the way the warmth began to spread through the small hut. It was in the melting of the snow on his robes. The answer was not a phrase or a concept. The answer was this. Just this. He sat before the growing warmth, and the distinction between the inner world and the outer world, which had already become transparent, now seemed to completely dissolve. The warmth of the fire was not just on his skin. It was the same warmth as the feeling of gratitude in his heart. The quiet hiss of the burning charcoal was the same sound as the stillness in his mind. He was not Kaito, a monk, sitting in a hut watching a fire. He was the watching. He was the warmth. He was the quiet sound. This was not a state of being spaced out or disconnected from reality. On the contrary, he felt more connected, more vividly alive than ever before. His senses were razor sharp. He could discern the different notes in the sighing of the wind, the subtle variations in the texture of the falling snow. He could feel the solid, dependable presence of the earth beneath the floor of the hut. But the central organizing principle of a separate self who was having these experiences had vanished. The hub of the wheel was gone, leaving only the turning. He realized that all his previous struggles had been born from this illusion of separateness. The anxious I who had to prove himself, the fearful I who had to protect himself from the world, the striving I who had to achieve enlightenment. This I was the source of all the conflict. It was a ghost, a phantom built of memories and concepts, and he had spent his entire life trying to satisfy its insatiable demands and soothe its endless fears. To be free of this ghost was not to be annihilated. It was to be truly born. It was to become one with the whole of life, to move with its currents, to participate in its dance without the clumsy, self-conscious interference of a separate ego. He thought of the wild boar he had seen months ago. The boar was not worried about being a good boar. It was not anxious about the judgment of the other animals in the forest. It did not strive to achieve boar enlightenment. It was simply, completely, and magnificently a boar. It was a perfect expression of the universe in boar form. And so was he. He was the universe expressing itself as a man named Kaito, sitting by a fire in a winter hut. There was no need to add anything to that, and nothing could be taken away. This understanding was not a final destination. It was not a static state of perfect bliss. It was the beginning of a new way of living. It was the key that unlocked a life of effortless grace. The challenges would still come. The snow would still need to be swept. The body would still feel cold and hunger. The mind would still produce thoughts. But he would no longer be identified with the struggle. He would meet each moment not as a problem to be solved by a separate self, but as a dance to be entered into by the whole of his being. He spent the rest of the winter in this state of quiet, luminous presence. His days were simple, stripped down to the bare essentials of living, and in this simplicity, he found a richness he had never imagined. The taste of a roasted sweet potato, the warmth of a cup of twig tea, the sight of the moon through the bare branches of the plum tree. Each of these simple events was a source of profound and complete satisfaction. He wanted for nothing. He lacked nothing. Each moment was full and perfect, just as it was. He noticed that even his dreams had changed. They were no longer the anxious, fragmented narratives of his past. His dreams were now vast, open, and filled with light. He would dream of flying over the snow-covered mountains, not as a man with wings, but as the wind itself. He would dream of being a single snowflake, falling through the silent air, dissolving into the great white expanse of the earth. He was losing his fixed identity, even in the world of sleep. As the winter began to wane, as the days grew infinitesimally longer, and the sun felt a little warmer on his face, he felt a sense of anticipation. But it was not the anxious anticipation of his past. It was the quiet, joyful anticipation of the earth itself, waiting for the coming of spring. He was no longer separate from the seasons. He was a part of their turning. He felt the first stirring of life deep in the frozen soil, and he felt it in his own heart as well. The great rest of winter was coming to an end. A time of new growth was approaching. He did not know what it would bring, and for the first time in his life, he was not afraid of the unknown. He was open to it, ready to receive whatever came, with a heart that had been emptied of fear and filled with a vast, silent, and listening peace. The song of the wind in the pines was no longer a sound from the outside. It was the music of his own true nature. Part 9. The Fullness of an Empty Cup. Spring arrived not as a single event, but as a series of quiet, humble miracles. It began with the sound of dripping water, a gentle, persistent rhythm as the sun's returning warmth began to melt the deep snow. Then came the first sight of dark, wet earth, appearing in small patches where the snow had grown thin. Kaito would watch these patches expand day by day, like a map of a new world being slowly revealed. The air, which had been sharp and sterile, began to soften, carrying the rich, fecund scent of thawing soil, a smell of pure potential. Kaito's own being mirrored this gentle awakening. The deep, inward stillness of winter began to stir, to stretch, to turn its face toward the light. He felt a new energy rising in him, not the anxious, nervous energy of his past, but a calm, steady, and purposeful vitality. It was the energy of a seed, dormant all winter, now beginning to push its way toward the sun. He greeted the first green shoots that poked through the soil with a feeling of joyful recognition. They were old friends returning. The wild mint, the chamomile, the hardy yarrow. They had survived the winter under their blanket of mulch and snow, and now they were re-emerging, their leaves of vibrant, almost impossibly bright green against the dark earth. He knelt in the mud, which was no longer cold and lifeless, but cool and teeming with unseen life, and he gently cleared the last of the winter debris from around them, his touch as tender as a mother's. His work in the garden resumed its former rhythm, but its quality was different. Before, his work had been a practice, a discipline, a way of training his mind. Now, it was simply an expression of his own nature. He did not have to remind himself to be mindful. His mind was naturally settled, his awareness and his actions a single, seamless flow. He moved with an effortless grace, his body attuned to the needs of the garden, his mind free of commentary or judgment. He was like a skilled musician who no longer thinks about the notes, but simply allows the music to flow through him. The garden flourished under his care. The soil, enriched by the compost he had so patiently tended, was dark and fertile. The plants grew with a vigor that astonished him. The small patch of wild strawberries he had transplanted spread, sending out runners that created a thick green carpet along the base of the stone wall. The medicinal herbs grew into lush, fragrant bushes, and the gnarled plum tree, which had been a symbol of death and decay, produced a miracle. One morning, he looked up and saw that its bare, twisted branches were covered in a profusion of delicate, pale pink blossoms. The beauty of it stopped him in his tracks. The blossoms seemed to float against the clear blue of the spring sky, each one a perfect 5-petaled star. A gentle breeze stirred the branches, and a soft shower of petals drifted down, dusting his robes and the ground around him. The air was filled with a faint, sweet fragrance. Kaito stood in the midst of this quiet explosion of beauty, and his heart was so full it felt like it might break. He was not separate from this beauty. He was a part of it. The same life force that was pushing the sap up the ancient trunk of the tree and unfurling these blossoms was the same life force that was beating in his own chest, breathing in his own lungs. He began to see that his mind was like the plum tree. For years it had seemed barren, twisted and lifeless, capable of producing only the sharp thorns of anxiety and the dead branches of despair. But all that time, deep within, the potential for blossoming had been dormant. The practice of stillness, of acceptance, of self-compassion, had been like the slow, patient turning of the seasons. It had created the conditions for this inner spring, allowing the life force that was always already there to finally express itself. His peace was not something he had built or achieved. It was something that had blossomed, naturally and effortlessly, when the long winter of his resistance had finally come to an end. His presence had changed. The anxious energy that had once radiated from him, the subtle aura of a man at war with himself, had been replaced by a quiet, stable calm. He was like a cup that has been emptied of a bitter, murky liquid and then washed clean. Now it stood empty, ready to receive whatever was offered. And because it was empty, it was also full. It was full of the sky, the sound of the birds, the scent of the plum blossoms, the warmth of the sun. This was the fullness of an empty cup. To be empty of a separate, striving self was to be full of the entire universe. To be free of the need to be someone, to achieve something, to get somewhere, was to be perfectly, completely present, right here, right now. Freedom, he understood, was not found in winning the fight or successfully completing the flight. Freedom was found in realizing the empty, silent space of awareness that holds both the impulse to fight and the impulse to flee. It was the space that held the storm and the calm, the winter and the spring, the sorrow and the joy. One day, a young monk from the main monastery appeared at the edge of the clearing. He was a new novice, his face fresh and earnest, and he carried a basket of supplies, rice, beans, and some new tools. He looked at Kaito with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The stories of the strange, silent monk in the forgotten garden had become a minor legend among the younger students. The novice bowed nervously.
"The master sent these, sir,"
he said, his voice barely a whisper. Kaito smiled, a warm, open expression that instantly put the young man at ease. He took the basket and bowed in return.
"Thank you. The journey is long. Please sit and rest. Let me make you some tea."
He led the novice to a smooth, flat stone that served as his bench and went to the stream to fetch fresh water. As he prepared the tea, his movements were calm and deliberate. He lit the small charcoal fire, heated the water, and whisked the powdered green tea into a frothy, vibrant liquid. There was no self-consciousness in his actions, no sense of performing a ceremony. He was simply making tea. He presented the bowl to the young monk with both hands. The novice took it, his eyes wide. He looked from the simple, beautiful bowl to Kaito's serene face.
"Sir,"
he began, his voice hesitant.
"is it true what they say? That you tamed a wild boar and commanded a storm to be still?"
Kaito laughed, a soft, gentle sound.
"The boar was just a boar," he said. "It was teaching me how to be still. The storm was just a storm. It was teaching me how to be strong. The garden is the real teacher. I'm just its humble student."
The novice sipped the tea. His eyes closed for a moment in appreciation.
"The tea is wonderful," he said. "I have never tasted tea like this."
"It is just water and tea," Kaito replied. "Perhaps you are just tasting the water." The young monk looked confused. Kaito gestured to the garden, to the plum tree, to the clear blue sky.
"When the cup is empty,"
he said softly,
"everything tastes as it is."
The novice did not understand with his mind, but he felt the truth of Kaito's words in the quiet, peaceful presence of the man before him. He felt the stillness of the garden, a stillness that was not empty,
but vibrantly alive. He felt his own anxious, striving heart begin to settle, just by being near this quiet monk. He stayed for an hour, though he had intended to stay only for a minute. He did not ask any more questions. He just sat and sipped his tea, and listened to the sound of the wind in the pines. When he finally left, he walked back down the path, not with the hurried steps of a boy running an errand, but with the slow, measured pace of a pilgrim who has just received a profound teaching. He had come expecting to see a fearsome ascetic, a tamer of beasts and storms. He had found instead a simple man with a gentle smile, a man who was as empty and as full as the sky, a man who had found the entire universe in a ruined garden and a simple bowl of tea. Kaito watched him go, then turned back to his work. The encounter had not disturbed his peace. It had been just another part of the day, like the passing of a cloud or the visit of a sparrow. He felt a gentle compassion for the young monk, for the familiar anxiety he saw in the boy's eyes. He saw his former self in him, the desperate seeker, looking for answers outside of himself. He sent a silent, formless wish for the boy to find his own garden, his own storm, his own stillness. He knelt back down in the soil, his hands sinking into the linkle, cool, dark earth. He was not a master. He was not enlightened. He was a gardener. His work was simple: to pull the weed that was in front of him, to water the thirsty plant, to offer a cup of tea to a visitor, to meet each moment just as it was, with an empty mind and a full heart. This was his practice. This was his life. And it was, he knew with a certainty that went deeper than bone, more than enough. The seasons continued their unhurried turning, and Kaito's life flowed with them, a small, quiet stream merging into a great river. The encounter with the young novice was the first of several such visits. Word of the transformed garden and the serene monk who tended it had spread through the monastery, not as a dramatic legend, but as a gentle, persistent rumor. Monks who were struggling with their practice, who felt lost in the complexities of the sutras or discouraged by their own restless minds, would occasionally make the pilgrimage up the winding path. Kaito never presented himself as a teacher. He never offered sermons or complex philosophical explanations. His teaching was in his presence, in the simple, unassuming way he lived his life. When a visitor arrived, he would greet them with the same gentle smile. He would stop his work, whether it was weeding or rebuilding the wall, and offer them tea. They would sit together on the smooth stone bench, and often, very few words were spoken. The visitors would speak of their struggles, their doubts, their feelings of inadequacy. Kaito would listen. He would listen with his whole being, without judgment, without formulating a response. He would simply hold their words in the vast, silent space of his own awareness. In this profound, compassionate silence, the visitors often found their own answers. Their frantic, tangled thoughts, when spoken into this accepting space, would begin to unravel. They would see their own struggles not as personal failings, but as part of the universal human condition. Sometimes, Kaito would respond not with words, but with a simple action. A monk once came to him, his face a mask of despair. "My mind is a hopeless tangle of weeds," the monk said. "I have been practicing for years, and I have made no progress. I am a failure." Kaito listened until the monk's torrent of self-criticism had exhausted itself. Then he said, "Come." He led the monk to a patch of the garden he was currently clearing. He handed him a small trowel. "Let us pull one weed together," he said. They knelt in the soil, side by side. Kaito did not instruct him. He simply worked, his movements slow, mindful, and deliberate. The monk, initially clumsy and impatient, gradually began to mirror Kaito's rhythm. They worked in silence for an hour, the only sounds the scrape of their trowels and the soft sigh of the weeds releasing their hold on the earth. When they finished the small patch, they stood up, their robes and hands covered in dirt.
The visiting monk looked at them.
Small, clear patch of dark soil. His face, which had been tight with anguish, had softened. A look of quiet understanding dawned in his eyes. "I see," he whispered. "It is just this. One weed at a time."
"Just this," Kaito affirmed with a gentle nod.
He had not given the monk a solution. He had shared his practice. He had shown him that the path to a clear mind was the same as the path to a clear garden, not through a grand, heroic battle, but through small, patient, and persistent acts of tending. The garden itself became a living sutra, a three-dimensional teaching that spoke more eloquently than any written text. To those who felt overwhelmed by the enormity of their spiritual task, Kaito would point to the stone wall, rebuilt one stone at a time. To those who felt barren and unproductive in their meditation, he would show them the gnarled plum tree, which had endured a long winter to produce its blossoms. To those who were harsh and critical of their own perceived flaws, he would show them his mended robe, explaining that the patched places were the strongest. He was not teaching a doctrine. He was sharing a way of being. He was demonstrating that peace is not found in some future, perfected state, but is available right now, in the midst of life's imperfections, in the simple, wholehearted engagement with the task at hand. His own practice continued to deepen. The experience of non-duality, which had been a dramatic revelation during the winter, now settled into a quiet, abiding reality. It was no longer a peak experience, but the very ground of his being. He saw that the world was not a collection of separate objects, but a single, flowing, interconnected process. The bee visiting the chamomile flower, the flower turning its face to the sun warming the earth nourishing the flower. It was all one seamless dance, and he was not separate from this dance. He was a part of it. His breath was the wind, his blood was the river, his bones were the stones. This deep sense of interconnectedness gave rise to a natural, unforced compassion. He could not harm another being without harming himself. He could not care for the garden without caring for himself. The distinction between self and other, which is the root of all fear and conflict, had become meaningless. He spent an entire summer observing the life cycle of a single morning glory vine that had sprouted near his hut. He watched it push its first 2 leaves out of the soil. He watched it send out a delicate, searching tendril. He built a small trellis for it and watched as it eagerly wrapped itself around the wood, climbing higher each day. He watched its beautiful, trumpet-shaped blue flowers open each morning to greet the sun and close each evening. He watched as the flowers faded and gave way to seed pods. He watched as the pods dried, opened, and released their seeds to the wind. And he watched as the vine itself, its purpose fulfilled, withered and died. In the life of this one small plant, he saw the whole of existence. He saw birth, growth, beauty, fruition, death, and the promise of rebirth. He saw that his own life was no different. It was a temporary, beautiful, and precious flowering of the great, mysterious life force of the universe. There was nothing to fear in its passing, any more than one would fear the fading of a morning glory blossom at the end of the day. There was only this moment, this brief, beautiful opportunity to bloom. He had become a master without ever intending to be one. He was a master not of sutras or of esoteric techniques.
but of the simple art of living. He had no desire for followers, no need for recognition. His life was his teaching. His silence was his sermon. His garden was his monastery. He had been sent to the very edge of the community, to a place of exile and ruin. And there, in the solitude and the silence, he had found the very heart of the path. He had emptied himself of all that he thought he was, and in that emptiness, he had found the fullness of all that is. Part 10. The Way of Water. The years flowed by, each one a season, each season a lifetime. The garden, once a symbol of Kaito's struggle, had become a testament to his peace. It was a place of profound and rugged beauty, a collaboration between his own mindful tending and the wild, untamable spirit of nature. The stone walls were strong, their mended places covered in a soft cloak of moss. The medicinal herbs grew in fragrant, abundant patches, and the gnarled plum tree, a faithful friend, produced its cloud of delicate blossoms each spring, and its small, tart fruit each summer. Kaito grew older. The lines on his face deepened, not from worry, but from years of smiling quietly at the sun. His movements, once stiff with anxiety, were now slow, fluid, and deliberate, like the gentle unfolding of a fern. He had become a part of the garden, and the garden a part of him. The boundary between the tender and the thing being tended had long since dissolved. His final and most profound teacher was the small stream that ran along the edge of the clearing. In the beginning, he had barely noticed it, its quiet gurgle just another background sound. But as his own mind grew quieter, he began to truly listen to it, and in its simple, constant flowing, he found the perfect expression of the wisdom he had come to embody. He would spend hours sitting on its bank, not in formal meditation, but in a state of open, receptive listening. He watched the water as it encountered obstacles. He saw how it met a large, immovable boulder in its path. The water did not stop. It did not try to smash the boulder with force. It did not retreat in frustration. It simply yielded. It divided, flowing around the rock on both sides, and then rejoined itself on the other side, its journey uninterrupted. It did not hold a grudge against the rock. It did not remember the obstacle. It simply continued on its way, its nature unchanged. In the water's effortless yielding, Kaito saw the story of his own life. For years, he had been the rock. He had been a hard, rigid thing, made of fear and fixed ideas about himself. He had tried to resist the flow of life, to stand firm against the currents of fear and uncertainty. And this resistance had been the source of all his pain, the friction that created the heat of his suffering. The practice of stillness, the surrender in the heart of the storm, had been his great lesson. He had learned to stop being the rock and to become the water. He had learned that true strength was not in rigidity, but in the ability to yield, to adapt, to flow around the obstacles of the mind without being broken by them. He saw how the water was powerful precisely because it was soft. Over years, the constant, gentle flow of the stream had smoothed the sharp edges of the stones in its bed, creating a path for itself through the earth. His own practice had been like this. It had not been a single, heroic act of will. It had been a gentle, persistent, day-by-day returning to the breath, a moment-by-moment choosing of acceptance over resistance. And this soft, patient practice had, over time, worn away the hard stone of his ego, carving a new, peaceful channel for his life to flow through. He observed how the water always sought the lowest place. It did not strive to be on the mountaintop. It was content to flow into the humble, hidden valleys. This, he understood, was the great teaching of humility. His own journey to peace had begun only when he had let go of the ambition to be a great monk, an enlightened master. He had found his truth not in the grand halls of the monastery, but here, in this lowly, forgotten garden. By accepting his own smallness, by embracing his own perceived inadequacy, he had found a peace that was as deep and as wide as the valley itself. And he saw the water's clarity. On a calm day, the stream would form still pools that reflected the world with perfect, unwavering precision. The blue of the sky, the green of the leaves, the flight of a dragonfly. But if he stirred the bottom, the water would become cloudy with mud and silt, its ability to reflect lost in its own turmoil. His mind, he knew, was the same. When it was stirred by the winds of fear and the currents of desire, it became murky, unable to see reality clearly. But when it was allowed to be still, when the mud of the ego was allowed to settle, its natural state of pristine, reflective clarity emerged. Peace was not something to be added, but a turbidity to be allowed to pass. One late autumn afternoon, as the maple leaves were turning a fiery red, Master Kenji made his way up the path to the garden one last time. He was very old now, his back bent, his steps supported by his long staff. Kaito saw him coming and went to meet him, bowing low and taking his teacher's arm to help him to the stone bench. They did not speak for a long time. They simply sat together, two old men, listening to the sound of the stream and the rustle of the dry leaves. The master's gaze moved slowly over the garden. He saw the strong, mended walls, the rich, dark soil, the healthy, thriving plants. But more than that, he saw Kaito. He saw the deep, quiet peace that radiated from him, the effortless way he inhabited his own skin. He saw a man who was as calm and as clear as the autumn air. Finally, the master turned to Kaito. His voice was a dry whisper, like the rustling of the leaves themselves. "I came here many years ago," he said, "and I gave a task to a young monk who was a prisoner of a great storm. I told him to tend this garden." He paused, and his eyes met Kaito's. "Tell me, Kaito, who is the gardener now?" Kaito looked at his old teacher, and his heart was filled with a boundless love and gratitude. He understood the question. The master was not asking for his name. He was asking who this presence was that sat here, this stillness that had tended the garden and, in doing so, had been tended by it. Kaito did not answer with words. He simply poured his master a cup of tea he had brewed from the wild mint in his garden. He held the simple, warm cup in both hands and offered it to him. His hands did not tremble. His mind was as still as the water in the cup. The offering was his answer. It said, "There is no gardener. There is only the tending. There is no one pouring the tea. There is only the pouring." A deep, knowing smile touched the master's lips. He accepted the cup, his old, wrinkled hands touching Kaito's. In that touch, a lifetime of teaching and learning, of struggle and release, came to a perfect, silent completion. "The water has returned to the source," the master whispered. He drank the tea, and they sat together in the fading light, two silent figures in a silent garden, their stillness merging with the great stillness of the mountain. And now, as Kaito's story comes to its gentle close, perhaps you can feel the wisdom of the water in your own body. His journey was not a struggle to be won, but a river to be followed, flowing naturally to the great, peaceful ocean of what is. You do not need to fight the thoughts that arise in your mind. You can be like the water, letting them flow past, around you, without resistance. They are just clouds, reflected for a moment on your surface, and then they are gone. You do not need to struggle against the feelings in your body. You can allow them to be, like the rocks in the stream bed. The gentle, persistent current of your breath can flow around them, softening their sharp edges until they too become a smooth and peaceful part of the landscape. Let your body be soft, yielding. Let go of the tension in your shoulders, in your jaw, in your hands. Let yourself sink into the low, humble place of deep rest. There is nothing you need to achieve, nothing you need to prove.
Simple act of resting is enough. Your mind, like the water, can find its own natural clarity. As you let go of the effort, as you cease to stir the bottom, the mud of the day's worries can slowly, gently settle. And in its place, a deep, quiet stillness can emerge. A stillness that has been here all along, waiting patiently beneath the turmoil. Feel yourself now as a quiet stream, flowing through a peaceful, moonlit garden. The journey of the day is over. The work is done. Now there is only this gentle, effortless flowing toward the great sea of sleep. Let the current of your breath carry you. Let it be your lullaby, soft, gentle, flowing, yielding to the pull of rest, sinking into a deep, silent, and nourishing peace. The water has returned to the source, and you can now return to the deep, quiet source of your own being and rest.